At 2:13 in the morning, Mara Bellamy's father signs away her life with a hand that won't stop shaking. 3 black SUVs sit in the rain outside what's left of the Bellamy estate. The cracked fountain, the dead hedges, the sagging front steps her mother used to sweep every Sunday. Men in tailored suits stand in the downpour like they don't feel it. One of them holds the contract. Another holds a pen. Her father takes the pen without looking at her. Mara watches from the doorway, in her nightgown and bare feet. She is 26 years old. She has a half-finished graduate thesis on her desk upstairs, a cold cup of tea on her nightstand, and 3 seconds left before her entire future is decided for her. Her father's signature hits the paper. Those men didn't come for money. The Vescari crime family came for her. If you've ever watched someone you loved choose their own survival over yours, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow Mara's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will shake you to your core. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The drive took 40 minutes. Nobody spoke to her. Mara sat in the middle seat between 2 men who stared at the road and smelled of cologne and gunmetal. She had been given 30 seconds to put on shoes. She hadn't been given a coat. The rain came down in sheets against the tinted windows, and she watched the streets of the city blur past gas stations, closed diners, the dark mouths of parking garages, and she kept waiting for the feeling of panic to arrive and do something useful. Didn't. She just felt cold. The Vares estate was not what she expected. She didn't know exactly what she'd expected, something gothic and menacing. Maybe something that announced what kind of man lived inside. Instead, it was a compound of clean, brutal lines behind a perimeter wall. No ornamentation, no wasted space. The gate opened without anyone speaking into a box. Either they were expected, or there were cameras everywhere. Probably both. She was walked through a side entrance. Not the front door. The side, like a delivery. That told her something right away. The man who met them in the interior hallway wore a dark shirt with no tie, and the expression of someone who had been awake for a very long time and resented it. He looked at her the way you look at a piece of furniture that's been put in the wrong room. Then he looked at the men who'd brought her. "What is this?" he said. Not a question. A sentence that had given up on being a question. "Mr. Vare." One of the suited men, the one who'd held the contract, stepped forward. "The Bellamy debt has been settled, per the terms arranged with—" "I know what the terms say." Silas Vare cut him off without raising his voice. "I'm asking what this is." He was looking at Mara again. She looked back. She'd decided in the car that she wasn't going to look at the floor. Looking at the floor got you nowhere. She'd watched her father look at floors his entire adult life, and here she was, standing in a stranger's hallway at 2 in the morning, with wet feet, so floor looking was clearly not a winning strategy. Silas Vare, was she cataloged this the way she cataloged everything? Quickly, and without sentimentality, tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a jaw that looked like it had been set permanently against something. He wasn't handsome in any easy way. He was the kind of man who'd stopped caring whether he was handsome a long time ago. "You think I wanted this marriage?" he said to her. Not to the men. To her. "No," Mara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I think someone wanted you to have me." The room went very quiet. The suited man shifted his weight. The other one by the door didn't move at all. Silas Vare stared at her with an expression she couldn't read, not anger, not curiosity, something somewhere between them that hadn't decided what it wanted to be yet. Then he said, "Put her in the East Wing. Don't touch her." And he walked away. The East Wing was 3 rooms and a private bathroom that cost more than anything Mara had ever owned. The bed had actual thread count. There was a reading chair positioned near a window that looked out over a walled garden. A tray of food had appeared on the dresser by the time a woman in her 50s, with a tight gray braid and no particular expression, showed her around. The woman's name was Devi. She said this once and didn't offer anything else. "Can I leave?" Mara asked. "The estate?" Devi said. "Yes." "No." "Can I leave this wing?" Devi considered this like it was a philosophical question. The main house is accessible during daylight hours. The grounds require escort. The gate requires Mr. Vare's authorization. "So no," Mara said. "I'll bring breakfast at 7, Devi said, and left. Mara sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. The food on the tray was real food, some kind of roasted chicken, bread, a small pot of tea still steaming, and her stomach lurched with hunger she hadn't noticed until right now. She hadn't eaten since lunch the day before. She hadn't known at lunch that by midnight her father would be signing her name on a crime family's debt contract. She ate. She wasn't going to starve herself out of pride. That was also a floor-looking move. While she ate, she thought about what she'd said to Silas Vare. "I think someone wanted you to have me." She hadn't planned to say it. It had just come out because it was true, and because the way he'd looked at her in that hallway told her clearly that this arrangement had surprised him as much as it had horrified her. A man like Silas Vare, she knew enough about the Vescari organization to know that much. You couldn't live in this city and not pick up the broad strokes, did not get surprised by his own operations. If he was surprised, then somebody else had engineered this, which meant the real question wasn't why her father had handed her over. It was who had told him to. She didn't sleep until almost 4. She lay in the expensive sheets and listened to the house settle and the rain slow and thought about her thesis, medieval property law, the mechanisms by which women were transferred between households as legal instruments, and felt the particular black humor of that coincidence settle into her chest like a stone. 7. Devi brought breakfast. At 8, Mara asked for paper and a pen. Devi brought both without comment. Mara started writing down everything she knew about the debt. The Bellamy family debt to the Vescari organization was, according to the documents she'd seen in the 6 months before this night, because her father had been careless with paperwork, careless with everything, careless in the particular way that disaster-prone people always are, somewhere in the range of $800,000. That was already catastrophic. That was already the product of 15 years of bad decisions compounding into a number that swallowed lives. But when the man at the gate had referenced the debt amount for verification before letting the SUVs through, Mara had heard the figure, $7.4 million. She pressed the pen hard enough against the paper to dent it. $7.4 million. Nearly 10 times what she'd believed the total to be. That wasn't debt accumulation. That wasn't interest. That was fabrication. Someone had been adding to the Bellamy debt for years quietly, systematically, making sure the number could never be repaid through any ordinary means. Someone had been building a trap. The question was whether the trap was meant for her father or for Silas Vare, or for someone else entirely. And the question under that was whether the man who'd looked at her in the hallway last night like she was furniture, in the wrong room, knew any of this, or whether he'd been handed this marriage contract the same way she'd been handed her shoes, without context, without choice, with 30 seconds to react. She didn't see Silas again until the 3rd day. The main house was accessible during daylight hours. Devi had said this, and it turned out to be literally true. The kind of precision that told you Devi was someone who meant what she said and had probably stopped offering comfort a long time ago. Mara used the access. She walked the ground floor hallways and the library and the large sitting room that no one seemed to actually sit in. She was watched, she could feel it. The quality of attention in a house, staffed by people who worked for a man who ran a criminal organization, but no one interfered with her. She was looking for something. She wasn't sure what. A detail that didn't fit. A door that shouldn't be there. A name she recognized. She found it on the 3rd day in the library. It was a ledger, not hidden exactly. It was on the 2nd shelf from the bottom, behind a row of law volumes that had clearly not been opened in years. The ledger itself was old, the spine cracked, the cover plain. No label. She pulled it because it looked wrong next to the law books. A different age and material. The way one item in a carefully arranged room will catch your eye by being slightly out of place. She opened it on the reading table and her hand went still. The first 10 pages were standard accounting numbers, dates, transaction codes, in a cipher she didn't recognize. But on the 11th page, written in a handwriting that was older and more deliberate than the accounting entries, was a name, D. Bellamy, consignment account. Original principal, arranged per verbal agreement, R. V. 11 years prior. David Bellamy, her father. R.V. She stared at those initials for a long time. The library door opened. Silas Vare came in without looking at her first. The way people move through spaces they own no announcement. No checking, just occupation. He was carrying a coffee cup and a folder, and he got 3 steps into the room before he registered her presence and stopped. His gaze dropped to the ledger on the table. Something shifted in his face. Not panic, not guilt. Something more controlled than either, the particular stillness of a person recalculating. "You shouldn't be in here," he said. "You said the main house was accessible during daylight hours." The library as he stopped. "Is what?" He didn't answer. He crossed the room in 4 strides, looked at the page she had open, and was quiet for several seconds. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Second shelf. Behind Blackstone's commentaries." Mara watched his face. The initials RV. "Does that stand for someone specific, or is that a general code in your organization's accounting system?" Silas set down his coffee cup. He did it with the kind of careful deliberateness that told her the thing he actually wanted to do was something else entirely. "Where did you learn to read account ciphers?" "I didn't. I read the plain text entries and drew reasonable conclusions." She turned the ledger slightly toward him, pointing to the 11th page. "My father's name is here. It's dated 11 years ago. The annotation says, the original debt was arranged by verbal agreement with someone whose initials are R. V. The Vascari family name starts with V, but the R doesn't match anyone named Ver. My father's name was Raphael," Silas said. Mara went still. Raphael Ver. He said it like he was putting something down that had been heavy for a long time. "He died 8 years ago." She looked at the ledger, at the date, at the initials. "Then my father made this deal with your father. Apparently. Before I was brought here, I believed my family owed your organization $800,000, Mara said. "I heard the gate verification when your men arrived. The figure they cited was $7.4 million. Silas picked up the ledger. He turned pages with a speed and precision that told her he'd read account books before, that this was not an unfamiliar language to him, even if the specific entries were. He stopped on a page toward the back. She hadn't gotten that far yet, and his jaw tightened. "This isn't our accounting format," he said. "Someone else's? Someone who wanted it to look like ours." He closed the ledger. "Someone who has had access to our internal documentation formats for a long time." They looked at each other across the reading table. "The debt is fraudulent," Mara said. Most of it, he said it like it cost him something to admit. "The original principle, whatever my father arranged with yours, that may have been real. Everything built on top of it over the last several years is manufactured. So someone has been systematically inflating a debt between our families. Yes. To create an obligation that could only be settled one way. Yes. To get me here," Mara said. Silas didn't answer immediately. He looked at the ledger in his hands, and then her, and she could see the calculation running behind his eyes, what she knew, what she might know, what it meant that she'd found this before he had. "Or to get something you have here," he said, "which is a different problem." That evening she sent a message to her father through Devi, who relayed communications without asking questions. She kept the message brief. "Tell me what you actually agreed to with Raphael Ver." The reply came back in an hour. "I don't know what you're talking about." She stared at her father's handwriting she recognized, his cramped, hurried script, even in the short note, and felt the specific grief of knowing exactly when a person is lying to you. She'd known that feeling her whole life. She'd just spent 26 years, hoping it would eventually stop. On the 5th day, someone tried to kill Silas Ver in his own home. Mara had been sitting by the window of her room in the early afternoon, working through the implications of what she had found in the ledger, trying to trace the fraudulent accounting entries back to a source. She'd gotten a rough timeline by cross-referencing dates, with what she knew of her family's financial history. The inflations had started approximately 6 years ago, slightly after the death of Raphael Ver, which was not a coincidence she planned to ignore. The walled garden below her window was where Silas sometimes walked in the late morning. She'd noticed this the way she noticed most things, cataloging, building a map of the household's rhythms. He walked alone. No phone. Just the walk, the same path, maybe 20 minutes. He was there now, coat on against the cold, hands in his pockets, and she was watching him without quite meaning to when the light shifted. Reflection. In the greenhouse glass at the garden's far end. The angle was wrong for it to be the sun. Too small, too sharp, with the particular quality of glare that came off a specific kind of curved surface, a lens. She was at the window latch and shouting before she'd finished processing the thought. Get down. Silas the shot hit the stone path 3 feet from where he'd been standing. He moved fast, much faster than she would have predicted for a man who walked with that much deliberate calm going sideways, and low behind a stone bench as a second shot came. Then he was moving again, and men were suddenly pouring into the garden from 2 directions, and the greenhouse glass exploded outward as whoever had been on the other side decided to run rather than stay. Mara stood at her window with her hand still on the latch. It took about 40 seconds. Silas looked up at her from the garden. He was crouched behind the bench, a gun in his hand that had appeared from somewhere, his coat ruined and his expression utterly unreadable. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he straightened up. He came to her room without knocking, which she'd started to accept as just how he moved through his own house. He still had the gun holstered now, and his coat was torn at the shoulder where a fragment of something had caught it. He wasn't injured. She checked automatically and then felt strange about having checked. There was a reflection in the greenhouse glass, she said before he could speak. The angle was wrong. I've been sitting at that window for 5 days. I know what the afternoon light looks like. You know what the afternoon light looks like. When something's different, it's different. She shrugged. You're not dead. I'm not dead, he agreed. He stood in the middle of her room with the ruined coat and looked at her with the calculation she was starting to recognize as just his baseline expression, not coldness. Exactly. More like perpetual assessment. You could have stayed at the window. I could have. Most people would have. Most people in my position would probably cry a lot more than I have, too. I'm not managing my situation correctly. She sat back down in the reading chair. Someone sent a shooter to your garden in broad daylight. That's not a casual operation. That's either a message or a very serious attempt. Both, Silas said. He pulled the chair from the writing desk without asking and sat in it backward, arms folded across the back. It was the most relaxed she'd seen him, which was still not very relaxed. What do you know about Victor Rusk? The name landed in her chest with a weight she'd been half expecting and half dreading. Criminal organization. Different network than yours. Rivals, I assume, since you're asking. More than rivals. Okay. He's been positioning for 3 years to take over territory my organization controls. Silas said it flatly, like he was reading from a report. He's patient. He moves slowly, and he doesn't make obvious mistakes. The fraudulent debt entries in that ledger match a timeline that puts the beginning of the inflation 6 years ago, approximately 2 years before Rusk started his consolidation push. Mara pulled her notes toward her. I'd put it at about 5.5 years, not 6. Close enough. She looked up. You think he manufactured the debt to engineer this marriage? I think someone did. But why marry me to you? What does that accomplish? Silas was quiet. Unless I'm not the point, Mara said slowly. Unless I'm the mechanism. Unless there's something I have, or know, or am that Victor Rusk needs inside this house. She spread her hands on her notes. I'm a graduate student studying medieval property law. I have a dying family estate, a thesis, and apparently a father who made a deal with a dead man 12 years ago. What could I possibly? She stopped. The thesis, the research, the documents her father had given her 3 years ago when she'd started her graduate work, old papers, family records, things he'd said came from the estate archives and might be useful for her work. She'd used some of them, filed. Most of them. There was a box in her apartment that she hadn't been able to get back to full of documents she'd never fully cataloged. My father gave me documents, she said carefully. 3 years ago. Family papers, he said. Silas was very still. I didn't look at all of them closely. I was focused on the medieval material, but some of them were more recent, 40, 50 years old, and I filed them without. She stopped again. He gave them to me 3 years ago. About 6 months after your father died. Those documents, Silas said, and his voice had gone to a register. She hadn't heard before, quieter, more controlled, which somehow made it worse. They contain what I think they contain. What do you think they contain? He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that she started to understand that whatever he was about to say was not something he said easily, or often, or to people he'd known for 5 days. My family didn't die in an accident. Silas said. My father, my uncle, my father's two partners. 8 years ago. The official record says it was a structural failure, the building they were meeting in. Gas line. Explosion, he stopped. It wasn't. Victor Rusk, Mara said. I've believed it for 8 years. I've never been able to prove it. His voice stayed flat and even. The person who arranged it covered their tracks well. There was a ledger, not the one you found. A different one. From my father's office that went missing the night of the explosion. It contained the financial records of a transaction that would have proven who hired the contractors, who tampered with the building. And you think my father has that ledger? I think your father found it, or was given it, or has been holding it for someone. He looked at her directly. I think the documents he gave you 3 years ago include either that ledger or copies of the relevant pages. And I think Victor Rusk has known about this for 3 years and has been maneuvering ever since to get those documents before I do. Mara sat with this for a moment. Her father had given her the documents. He had told her they were family papers. He had put them in her hands, his graduate student daughter, who would sort them methodically, file them carefully, keep them safe without knowing what she was keeping, and she had done exactly what he'd designed her to do. He used me as a safe deposit box, she said. Yes. And now Victor Rusk wants to open me. She pressed her lips together. And my father sent me here not because the debt forced him to, but because he calculated that this was the safest place for me to be. Possibly. That's a deeply strange way to show paternal concern. Your father is a deeply strange man. That's putting it gently. She looked at her notes again, then at Silas. I need to get back to my apartment. Those documents. I had your apartment secured the morning after you arrived. My people photographed and cataloged everything in that box. He said it without apology, with the directness of someone who had long since stopped pretending that courtesy and necessity always went in the same direction. I've been reviewing the catalog. I hadn't gotten to the implications yet, because you didn't know I'd found the ledger, because I didn't know you were the kind of person who would find the ledger. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the garden was full of his men sweeping the perimeter, the broken greenhouse glass catching the fading afternoon light. The shooter today, Mara said. That was a message that the timeline is accelerating. Yes. Victor knows I'm here. He knows the documents might be here. Yes. Then we're running out of whatever time we had. She picked up her pen. Tell me everything you know about Victor Ruck's operation and the people in your organization who have regular contact with his network. Because that ledger I found was placed where someone wanted it found, which means someone in your house has been waiting for me to start asking the wrong questions. Silas looked at her. Raleigh looked at her, the kind of look that was also a decision. And for the first time in 5 days in his house, he didn't look like a man trying to figure out what she was for. He looked like a man who had just realized she was asking the right questions. His name is Calder Wynn, Silas said. He's been with my organization for 11 years. He's the one who handled the logistical negotiations for your family's debt contract. Mara wrote the name down. Outside, the last light left the garden, and the broken glass stopped catching it. And somewhere on the other side of the city, the pieces of a trap that had been building for 8 years were finally starting to turn toward each other. Calder Wynn. Mara wrote the name and underlined it once, not twice. Once was enough. Twice would have felt like panic, and she wasn't there yet. Silas watched her write it. He was still sitting backward on the desk chair, with his arms folded across just the back and his ruined coat on, and she had the distinct impression that he was not a man who sat in other people's rooms often. The posture was his controlled, self-contained, but the location was wrong for him. And she could feel the slight wrongness of it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. 11 years, she said. Yes. He was with your organization when your father was alive. He came in the year before my father died. My father hired him personally. Mara set the pen down. So either Calder Wynn spent 11 years building trust for a single operation, or he was flipped at some point and someone decided he was more valuable inside than eliminated. Victor Rusk doesn't flip people, Silas said. He buys them. There's a difference. What's the difference? Flipped people are afraid. Bought people are motivated. He said it with the kind of precision that told her this wasn't a philosophical distinction. For him, it was operational. Something he'd learned by watching what each type of person did under pressure. Wynn isn't afraid of anything. He never has been. Which is why I trusted him. Which is why Rusk bought him. Yes, they sat with that. Outside the window, the sweep team was still moving through the garden, flashlights strobing across the stone paths. Someone had put a tarp over the broken greenhouse frame. The mundane logistics of an assassination attempt, Mara thought. Someone gets shot at, and within an hour there's a tarp. Does Wynn know about the documents my father gave me? She asked. If Rusk knows, Wynn knows. Then Wynn knows I'm here and he knows why. She picked up the pen again. Place that ledger for me to find. Silas's expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes sharpened. Explain. The ledger was behind the Blackstone volumes. I noticed it because it looked wrong age, wrong material, not matching its neighbors. But that shelf has been there for years. If it had been placed there a long time ago, it would have gathered the same dust as everything around it. It hadn't. She looked at him steadily. Someone put it there recently. Someone who knew I'd been given access to the library. Someone who knew how I think, or at least knew, that I'm the type to notice things that don't fit. Wynn has access to your file, Silas said quietly. I have a file? Everyone who enters this house has a file. He said it without apology, with the same directness as before. This is the reality of what I am. Take it or leave it. Educational background, professional history, psychological profile based on publicly available behavior patterns. A psychological profile. Mara absorbed this, and from that profile, Wynn concluded I would find the ledger and draw the right conclusions. He concluded you'd find it and bring it to me, Silas said, which would force a conversation that would tell him exactly how much I knew and when I knew it. He was watching. This house has more cameras than you've noticed. Some of them are mine. Some of them he stopped. Some of them are his, Mara finished. The rain had come back, a different quality than the night she'd arrived, lighter, more persistent. She could hear it against the window glass, like fingers tapping without urgency. Kind of rain that settles in for the long night. You need to act normally around him, she said. Wynn. Can't let him know you suspect. I've suspected Calder Wynn for 4 months, Silas said flatly. I act normally around him every day. That's not the problem. Then what is? The problem is that I can't move against him without proof, and if I have him watched too closely, he'll know. He's been in this organization long enough to recognize surveillance patterns. He unfolded from the chair stood. The movement was abrupt, not anger, more like a man who'd hit the boundary of what sitting still would accomplish. And the problem under that is that if he goes dark, Rusk loses his eyes in this house and escalates. Today's shooter was a message. If Wynn disappears, the next thing Rusk sends won't be a message. Mara thought about this. How many people in your organization know about the documents? About what my father might have? Before tonight? 2. Myself and the man who cataloged your apartment. Where's that man now? A pause. Brief but real. I don't know, Silas said. His name was Brennan. Mara learned this in the morning, when Silas came to her room at 7, with the controlled expression of someone managing bad news before it could manage. Brennan had been found in the parking structure, 3 blocks from Mara's apartment building. His car was still running. He had been dead for approximately 6 hours. Mara sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and did not look at the floor. He cataloged the documents the morning after you arrived, Silas said. He was standing by the window, not looking out. He sent me the photographs and then went back to his regular rotation. And someone knew he'd been there. Someone had the apartment under watch already, which means Rusk knew about those documents before I did. He turned from the window. His face was composed in the way that cost something. Brennan had a daughter. She's 11. Mara was quiet. He worked for me for 7 years, Silas said. He was good at his job, and he didn't ask unnecessary questions. And now he's dead in a parking structure because someone needed to know how much information had moved. He said it with no particular inflection, and she understood that the lack of inflection was itself a kind of grief, the kind that had nowhere to go in a man like him, that just got compressed and stored somewhere structural. I'm sorry, she said. Don't. Not harshly. Just not. Sympathy doesn't help me think. Then here's something that might. She stood up. Rusk killed Brennan to find out what was photographed. But if Brennan was professional enough to work for you for 7 years without asking unnecessary questions, he was professional enough to keep the photographs secure. The photos are encrypted. Standard protocol. So Rusk knows documents were cataloged but doesn't know exactly through what's in them. She crossed her arms, which means he still needs me. I'm the one who knows what my father gave me, what I actually looked at, what I might have read closely enough to be useful as a witness. He doesn't need you as a witness. He needs to make sure you're not one. Same result, different motive. He needs me accessible. She looked at Silas. The charity gala. My father mentioned it in a letter 2 weeks ago. I'd forgotten until now. He'd been planning to attend, said it was important. He made a point of telling me the date. Silas went very still. He told me the date of a charity gala in a letter he sent 2 weeks before men showed up in our driveway to collect a debt he'd known was coming, Mara said. That's not a man sharing his social calendar. That's a man creating a reference point. She asked to see the letter. Silas had it within the hour. Her apartment had been thoroughly documented. Every piece of paper photographed, and she sat at the library table with the photograph of her father's handwriting and read it 3 times. The letter was mostly inconsequential. Updates on the estate, a vague complaint about legal fees, 2 sentences about the gala, the Harmon Foundation event, the city's annual charity auction, kind of function where money moved under cover of philanthropy and everyone pretended not to notice. He mentioned it with a casualness that was slightly too casual. He mentioned that it would be a good opportunity for networking, for reconnecting. He used the word reconnecting in a context that didn't quite make sense for a man who had almost no professional connections left. Unless reconnecting meant something specific, unless he was telling her, in the way men like David Bellamy communicated things they were afraid to say directly, which was through implication and misdirection, and the hope that the person they were talking to, smart enough to read the gap between the words where and when, something was going to happen. He was warning me, she said. Silas, across the table, looked up from the copy of the letter he'd been reading. Or setting you up. Both things can be true. She smoothed the photograph flat with her palm. He's not a good man. I've known that for a long time. But he is my father, and he has enough left of whatever he used to be to want me not to be killed at a charity auction. So he told me, in the only way he knows how, which is sideways and half-coded and completely deniable. Victor's men are going to take you at the gala, Silas said. Not a question. Yes, your father arranged it. Yes. She said it clean, no flinching. She'd had the night to get there. He arranged it because Rusk told him to, and he agreed because he's been working for Rusk in some capacity for long enough that he doesn't know how to say no anymore. Or possibly because Rusk has something on him that makes refusal impossible. But he sent me that letter because he needed me to have some kind of warning, however useless. Silas was quiet for a moment. The gala is in 9 days. 9 days. You want to use it? I want to use it, Mara said. I want to go to that gala and let Rusk's men take me. And I want Rusk to believe he's won, and I want you to be waiting on the other end of wherever they take me. Silas looked at her. She'd noticed this quality in him. Over the past several days, he didn't look away from things that were uncomfortable or complicated, or that he disagreed with. He looked directly at them until he'd finished deciding. That's an extremely dangerous proposal from someone who has never run a counter-operation. You're not wrong, she said. But I'm the only person in the situation who Rusk has a reason to keep alive long enough to retrieve the documents from. That's a window. Windows close. Yes. So we need to move carefully and quickly through this one. She folded her hands on the table. First, I need to know something. What? Calder Wynn. Does he know you suspect him? Silas held her gaze. No. Are you certain? The pause was fractional. No, he admitted. Then we have to operate on the assumption that anything said in this house is potentially compromised, Mara said, including this conversation. He looked at her for a moment and then reached into his jacket pocket and put a small device on the table between them. Silver and flat, smaller than a matchbook. Signal jammer, he said. Local radius only. I turned it on when I came in. Mara stared at it. You came prepared. I came operational, he said. There was something almost dry in it. Not quite a joke, but the space where a joke might have lived in a different man. She picked up her pen. Then let's build the plan. Calder Wynn came to the library that afternoon. He knocked, which was something Silas didn't do, and entered with the particular ease of a man who was comfortable. Everywhere he'd been long enough to map. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that looked open and competent, the face, Mara thought, of a man who had spent 11 years making sure people looked at his competence and missed his intentions. He had gray at his temples and good hands, and he introduced himself to her with a warmth that was practiced so deeply it had almost become real. "Miss Bellamy," he said, "I hope you've been comfortable." "Comfortable is a flexible concept," Mara said pleasantly. "Yes, thank you." He smiled. He had a good smile, which was probably among his more dangerous qualities. "I wanted to personally apologize for the circumstances of your arrival. The situation with your family's account was handled with less care than it should have been." "Was it?" Mara said. Silas was behind her, standing near the window, and she didn't turn to look at him because she didn't need to. She could feel the quality of his stillness from across the room, the specific kind of attention he paid when he was watching and not acting. "The debt structure was complicated," Calder said. He settled into a chair across from her with the ease of a man who sat in expensive chairs all his life. "These arrangements often are, over time. Accounts accumulate irregularities. $7.4 million worth of irregularities," Mara said. Something shifted in Calder's face. Small, almost nothing. Gone before she could name it. "There were compounding factors," he said smoothly. "I'm sure." She smiled back at him with her best graduate student expression, which was the one she used on professors who were condescending and wrong simultaneously. "It must be very complicated, managing accounts with that level of irregular accumulation. Over years, without anyone noticing." The pause was a fraction of a second longer than it should have been. "That's actually something I've been reviewing," he said. "The account history. To make sure the records are clear going forward." "How thorough," Mara said. After he left, Silas came and stood beside her, and they were both quiet for a moment. "He came to see what you knew," Silas said. "He came to see what I'd told you," Mara said. "There's a difference. He'll report to Rusk that you've been asking about the debt structure." "Good." She set the pen down. "Let him. Rusk needs to believe I'm unsettled and asking the wrong questions. If he thinks I'm focused on the money and the irregularities, he won't be watching for the other angle." "What other angle?" "The document," she said. "I need to find a way to make Rusk believe the documents are elsewhere. Not in this house. Not in my apartment, somewhere he hasn't looked yet. Somewhere that will pull his attention away from us long enough to move." Silas was quiet. "Can you give me a full list of the documents Brennan photographed?" she asked. "I need to know exactly what Rusk's people saw in that apartment. It'll take a few hours to compile." "Then we have a few hours." She looked at him. "I also need to speak with my father." Silas's expression changed in a way she was getting better at reading. Not disagreement exactly, but the recalibration of a man who had already considered this and filed it under necessary but unpleasant. "In person or via communication?" "In person." She held his gaze. "There are things you can't get from a letter or a phone call. You need to see someone's face. It's not safe. Nothing about this is safe. That's been true since day one." She kept her voice even. "I need to look my father in the eye and ask him what he gave Victor Rusk and what Rusk gave him in return. And I need to see whether the answer is fear or something else." "Why does the distinction matter?" "Because if it's fear, there's something left to work with," she said. "And if it's something else," she stopped. "Then I need to know that too, before I walk into a charity gala with his fingerprints all over the trap." The meeting with her father happened on the 7th day, in a neutral location that Silas' people spent 2 days vetting and Wynne was deliberately not told about. The location was a private dining room above a restaurant in the financial district, the kind of place where the booths had high backs, and the staff understood that some conversations required selective deafness. David Bellamy looked 10 years older than the last time she'd seen him, which had been 4 months ago at a lunch that had felt obligatory and ended early. He was a tall man who had gone thin in the wrong way. Not health thin, attrition thin. His suit was still good. He wore it like armor he no longer believed in. Stood up when she came in. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected him to stay seated, to manage the room the way he'd always managed rooms, from a position of practiced authority. Instead, he stood, and his hands were at his sides, and he looked at her with an expression that she didn't have a name for, and wasn't sure she wanted one. "Mara," he said. "Sit down, Dad," she said. "We don't have a lot of time." She sat across from him. Silas was not in the room his decision, and she hadn't argued, because some conversations required the absence of an audience. Two of his men were outside the door, which was as close to private as this situation was going to get. "The gala," she said. "Victor Rusk's men are going to take me there." Her father said nothing. His hands were on the table now, not quite flat. The small tension in his fingers was the only thing that moved. "You arranged it," she said. "Mara." She said it the same way Silas had said it to her. Not harshly, just not. "Don't manage this. Just tell me why." The silence lasted long enough that she started counting her own breaths. 1, 2, 3. "He has a recording," her father said. His voice was low and rougher than she remembered. "From 12 years ago, a conversation I had with Raphael Vare about money that moved through certain channels. It's enough to put me in prison. It's enough to take everything." "There's nothing left to take," she said. "We have a crumbling estate and a $7.4 million fraudulent debt. The estate has legal title. If I'm convicted, the title transfers differently." He met her eyes. "Your mother's name is still on parts of the property. It would affect you." Her mother had been dead for 9 years. Her father was still making decisions based on a woman who was no longer there to object to them. Mara pressed her palms flat on the table. "What did you give him, Dad? What did Victor Rusk get from you, specifically?" Her father looked at the table. "Access," he said. "Financial access early on, and then later information. About Raphael's accounts. About what Raphael had documented." "The murder," Mara said. Her father flinched. The first real physical reaction since she'd sat down. "I don't know what you know. I know enough. Raphael Vare documented a transaction that proves Rusk ordered the killing of his family. That documentation went missing the night of the explosion. You have it, or you had it, until you gave it to me 3 years ago inside a box of papers you just told me were family records." The silence this time was different, heavier. "You were the safest place," he said. "You used me as a hiding place for evidence in a murder case. I was trying to protect it." He looked up. His eyes were the wrecked, honest eyes of a man who had run out of justifications and was just standing in what he'd done. "Rusk didn't know you had it. He knew I'd had it, but I'd given him other things. Led him to believe I'd destroyed the original documentation. He believed me for 3 years. Until he didn't," Mara said. "Until someone told him otherwise." "Calder Wynne," she said. Her father's face confirmed it before he spoke. "I don't know his name, but someone inside the Vare organization. Someone who knew enough about Raphael's records to understand what they were looking for." Mara sat back. The dining room was quiet. She could hear the sound of the restaurant below, the faint clatter of a kitchen in motion, the mundane mechanical sound of a city running the way cities ran while terrible things happened inside them. "You offered me to Silas Vare," she said. "Not because the debt forced you to, because you needed me, somewhere Rusk's people couldn't easily reach. You calculated that Silas would keep me safe because he'd want to know what I had." "I calculated wrong," apparently, her father said. "Because you're here talking to me, which means Vare let you out of that compound, which means things are moving faster than your plan anticipated," Mara said.
"Yes."
She looked at him steadily. "I need you to do something." He looked at her with the wariness of a man who had burned through his credit and knew it. "I need you to confess," she said. "On record, everything, the financial access you gave Rusk, the information, what you knew about Raphael's documentation, everything." She kept her voice level. "I need a recorded confession that ties Rusk to the murder through your testimony. Mara, that will expose you. Yes, it will." She didn't soften it. "You should have thought about that 12 years ago, or 11, or 6, or 3. You had a lot of chances to think about it, and you made other choices. This is what's left." Her father looked at his hands. "I'm going to walk into that gala in 2 days," she said. "I'm going to let Rusk's men take me, and I'm going to bring the documentation and your recorded confession, and Silas Vare is going to be at the other end of wherever they take me, and Victor Rusk is going to answer for what he did to that family." She paused. "And you are going to answer for what you did to ours." The silence was very long. "Mara," her father said. His voice had gone to something that was barely a voice. "I'm sorry." She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at him, at the thinned face and the ruined suit and the hands that had signed her name on a contract at 2 in the morning, and she felt the grief of it move through her cleanly, without ceremony, like weather passing. "I know," she said. "I'll make sure they give you a lawyer." She walked out. She didn't look back. Looking back was a floor-looking move, and she was done with those. She was halfway down the stairs when the restaurant's front window exploded inward. The sound was massive and wrong, not a gunshot, something bigger. Got a pressure wave that knocked sideways into the wall and filled the stairwell with glass dust and the sharp chemical smell of something burning. She grabbed the railing and stayed on her feet by instinct rather than balance, and she could hear shouting from outside and the two-hear shouting room door coming fast down the stairs. Behind her, honking, and someone on a radio saying something in clipped syllables she couldn't parse. She got to the bottom of the stairs. The restaurant's front was gone, tables overturned, the kitchen staff pressed against the back wall, a car on the sidewalk outside, still moving in a lazy spin. Not a bomb. A vehicle. Someone had driven a car through the front window of the restaurant. One of Silas's men grabbed her arm and turned her toward the kitchen, toward the back exit, moving fast and low. Through the demolished front window, she saw 3 men cross the sidewalk at a run. They were not looking at the car. They were looking at her. She ran. Kitchen was noise and heat, and the back door was a fire exit that opened into a service alley, and the man with her was on his radio. And they were moving fast toward the alley's end, where a car was already pulling up Silas's people, responsive. 2 days of operational preparation paying out, and she got to the car door and turned. The 3 men from the restaurant were at the alley's entrance. One of them had a phone up, taking photographs, not trying to reach her, just documenting. She got in the car. The door closed. They moved. "That wasn't an abduction attempt," she said, breathing hard. The man beside her, not Wynne, a different man. One of the ones she'd seen outside the dining room door, shook his head. "No, it was surveillance. They wanted to see who I met with. They wanted confirmation." "Yes, ma'am." Which meant Rusk now had photographic confirmation that Mara Bellamy had met with her father outside the Vare compound. Which meant he knew the conversation had happened. Which meant the timeline had just collapsed from 2 days to something considerably shorter. She pulled out the small notebook she carried and wrote one sentence. "Rusk knows. Move now or not at all." She underlined it once. The car moved through the city and the rain came back heavier than before and somewhere like architecture of a plan that had just had its foundation kicked out. She started building the next version of it from whatever was left standing. Car was still moving when Mara's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She answered it because unknown numbers had stopped being something she could afford to ignore approximately 48 hours ago. Silence on the line. Then breathing. Then a voice she recognized and hadn't expected. "He has the recording," her father said. He was whispering, which meant he was still in the restaurant, or what was left of it, or somewhere near it. "Mara, the confession I made Rusk already has it." She went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the rain against the car windows. "What do you mean he already has it?" "I made a recording 3 months ago. A version of it. I was pressured. He knew I'd been talking to someone. He didn't know who, and I gave him a version to satisfy him." The whispering was fraying at the edges. It wasn't complete. It didn't include everything. But it was enough to what? Enough to prove I gave him access to the Vare accounts. Which means if he releases it, it doesn't just implicate me. It implicates the Vare organization in financial misconduct that he stopped. It creates grounds for a federal investigation into Silas's entire operation. Mara pressed her hand flat against the car window. The glass was cold. "You gave Rusk a weapon against Silas. I gave him something I thought he'd use against me alone. I didn't understand what he was building with it. Dad." She kept her voice very quiet because the man beside her was listening, and she needed to think clearly, and loudly expressing what she was actually feeling would not help either of those things. "Did you give him this recording before or after you arranged for his men to take me at the gala?" The silence was its own answer. "Before," she said. "Mara." She ended the call. She sat with the phone in her hand and breathed through her nose and looked at the city moving past the window an ordinary Thursday afternoon. People on sidewalks with coffee cups and dry cleaning. A normal city's running its normal machinery, and she thought about what she'd just learned. with the specific ice water clarity of someone who has run out of the luxury of being shocked. Her father hadn't just arranged to hand her to Rusk's. He had armed Rusk against Silas beforehand, which meant Rusk had leverage over Silas's operation that predated any of their planning, any of the counter-strategy they'd built in the last 9 days, which meant Rusk didn't need Mara to destroy Silas. He could do it from where he was standing. He needed Mara for something else. She looked at the man beside her. I need to speak with Silas. Now, not at the estate. They met in the back office of a property management company that Silas apparently owned through 4 layers of shell corporations and used for exactly this kind of conversation. The room was bare in the functional way of rooms that existed for use rather than comfort. A table, chairs, a whiteboard with nothing on it, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they hadn't slept, which in Mara's case was accurate. Silas came in 2 minutes after she did. He read her face before she spoke, which she was getting used to that quality of assessment, the way he processed information through his eyes before his expression responded to it. The restaurant, he said. The restaurant is the small problem. She told him about the phone call. She told him cleanly and without editorializing, because editorializing would take time she wasn't sure they had. She watched his face as she talked, the jaw setting, the particular stillness that arrived when he was absorbing, something that changed the shape of a problem. When she finished, he was quiet for 12 seconds. She counted. He has grounds for a federal referral, Silas said. Yes. If he releases that recording, your entire operation gets investigated. Counts frozen, personnel exposed, operational capacity gutted while the investigation runs. She spread her hands on the table. He doesn't need to win a criminal case. He just needs to trigger the investigation. The disruption alone cripples you long enough for him to move on the territory. And take everything my father built, Silas said. Everything you've built. She held his gaze. Your father's been dead for 8 years. This is yours. He looked at her for a moment with something she didn't quite have a name for, then looked away. The recording changes the gala plan. It changes everything, she said. If we go forward with the original plan, let Rusk take me, lead him into a trap, he can detonate the recording the moment he feels the trap closing. His exit strategy isn't escape. It's mutually assured destruction. He burns your organization on his way out. And it doesn't matter if we have the murder evidence, because you're too compromised to use it. So we need the recording before we move, Silas said. We need the recording, and we need to know every copy it exists in, and we need to eliminate all of them simultaneously with the gala operation. She looked at him, which means we need Calder Wynn. The fluorescent light buzzed once, a brief flicker. Silas's expression didn't change. Wynn knows where Rusk keeps his operational files, Mara continued. He's been feeding information both directions for 11 years. He knows the architecture of Rusk's data storage. If we can flip him, Wynn can't be flipped, Silas said. I told you, he's bought. Everyone who's bought can be outbid. She kept her voice level, scared. Bought people are motivated, she said. So we find his motivation, and we change the math on it. Silas was quiet. What does Calder Wynn want? She asked. Underneath the money, what does he actually want? The silence stretched. Then Silas said, he wants out. Mara waited. He came to me 4 months ago. Indirectly through a cutout, someone he trusted to carry a message without revealing the source. He asked about certain arrangements. Relocation, identity restructuring, the kind of infrastructure you build for someone who needs to stop being who they are. Silas's voice was flat and precise, reporting, not confessing. I didn't respond. I didn't know at the time that it was him specifically, but I knew it was someone inside the organization. And I didn't know who to trust with the intelligence. He wants to disappear, Mara said. He wants to have built enough of a nest somewhere that he can walk away from all of this and not be found by either side. So he's not loyal to Rusk. He's contracted to Rusk and looking for an exit. Yes. Then we give him the exit. She straightened in the chair. We offer him what he actually wants: real relocation, real infrastructure, real safety, in exchange for the location of Rusk's files and the recording. And then we trust him to deliver accurate information, Silas said, while knowing he's been lying to my face for 4 months and feeding my operational details to my worst enemy. Trust him, Mara said. We verify everything he gives us independently before we move. And we structure the exchange so that he doesn't get the exit until after we've confirmed the information was accurate. He'll know it's a potential setup. Of course he will. He's smart enough to have survived 11 years in this position. But he'll also know that if it's not a setup, if we're genuinely offering what he wants, then this is his only chance at it. She looked at Silas steadily. The alternative is he stays loyal to Rusk and goes down with him when this ends. And it will end. He's been calculating that probability for months. That's why he sent you that message through the cutout. Silas stood up. He walked to the whiteboard and stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched the line of his shoulders and the way he held his hands not in his pockets, just at his sides, loose, the posture of a man running through scenarios at a speed she couldn't see. If we contact Wynne, he said to the whiteboard, and he reports the contact to Rusk, then Rusk knows we know about him and moves immediately. She nodded. That's the risk. It's a significant risk. They all are. She paused. The gala is in 36 hours. Whatever we do it before that. Turned around. I'll contact the cutout. Cutout was a woman named Sella who ran a bookbinding shop in the old quarter and had the unremarkable appearance of someone who had spent 30 years making themselves unremarkable. She received the message from Silas's man at 9 in the evening, and the response came back in 2 hours. Wynne would meet, alone, a location of his choosing. The location was the rooftop parking structure of a hotel near the waterfront, kind of brutalist concrete structure that existed in every city as a testament to the period, when someone decided that function and aesthetic had nothing to say to each other. Level 5. Open air. No sightlines from adjacent buildings at that height on that block. Wynne had chosen it carefully. Silas went alone because Wynne had specified it, and because Mar had argued for 20 minutes that she should be there, and lost. She stayed in the property management office with Devi, who had materialized at some point in the evening without explanation, and now sat across the table from her, with a thermos of coffee and the expression of someone who had waited out worse situations than this. Mara read through the photograph documents for the 4th time. Pages her father had given her. The ones from the box in her apartment, she'd been through them enough now to have them mapped in her head, to know which pages contained the financial transaction records that tied Rusk to the Vare family murders, which pages were supporting documentation, which were the accounting entries in Raphael Vare's own handwriting that created a chain of evidence 8 years old and still intact. She also found, on her 4th pass, something she hadn't caught before. It was on a page she'd categorized as supplementary, a list of names and dates that she'd initially read as a personnel rosters of some kind. Looking at it again with everything she now knew, it wasn't a roster. It was a witness list. Raphael Vare had known, before he died, that what he'd documented would need corroboration. He had identified 7 individuals who had direct or indirect knowledge of the transaction Rusk had used to fund the Vare family murders. 7 people who, combined with the financial documentation, would constitute an overwhelming evidentiary case. 6 of the 7 names she didn't recognize. The 7th name was Calder Wynne. She stared at it. The fluorescent light buzzed. Devi poured coffee into a cup and pushed it across the table without comment. Calder Wynne had known about the murder, had known about the documentation, had known or had reason to know that Raphael Vare had recorded his name as a witness, which meant his 11 years inside the Vare organization were not simply about money. They were about controlling what happened to that witness list. They were about making sure that if the documentation ever surfaced, Wynne was positioned to either suppress it or to have already been granted immunity by the other side. He wasn't looking for an exit because he was tired of the life. He was looking for an exit because he was afraid of being on that list. Mara picked up her phone and called Silas. It went to voicemail. He was in the meeting. She left no message. You didn't leave messages in these situations. And put the phone down and looked at the witness list and thought very carefully. The meeting on that rooftop was not what either of them had thought it was. Wynne wasn't coming to negotiate an exit. Wynne was coming to find out how much Silas knew about the witness list. If Silas revealed it, if he mentioned the documents, the financial records, the chain of evidence, Wynne would know his name was on that list. And a man who had spent 11 years positioning himself would not sit still for that. She was on her feet before she'd finished the thought. "I need a car," she told Devi. Devi looked at her. Mr. Vare said, "I know what he said." She was already moving toward the door. "I need a car." She got to the parking structure at level 3, before Silas's man on the stairwell stopped her. She didn't argue with him, just showed him the photograph of the witness lists on her phone, with Wynn's name circled, and watched him process it. And then he was on his radio, and they were moving up together. Level 5 was open to the sky. The rain had stopped, but the concrete was wet, the reflected glow of the city below giving everything a flat, washed-out quality. Silas was standing near the eastern parapet, and Calder Wynn was 6 feet from him. And the conversation had the particular texture of two people who were being careful with every word. She could see it in their postures even from the stairwell door, 20 meters away. She crossed the distance fast, and Wynn saw her before Silas did, and something happened in his face, a rapid reassessment. The expression of a man recalculating in real time. Silas turned. He saw her face and stopped talking. "His name is on the witness list," she said. She wasn't looking at Silas. She was looking at Wynn. Raffle Vare documented 7 witnesses to the transaction. Calder is number 4. The wet concrete was very quiet. Somewhere below, the city moved and hummed. Wynn stood very still, with his hands loose at his sides, and his face had gone to a neutrality that was almost perfect, the kind of professional blank that took years to build and was itself a kind of confession. "Is that true?" Silas said. "Not tomorrow." Wynn looked at him. Something moved behind the neutrality, not remorse, not guilt, more like the final calculation of a man who had been running numbers for 11 years and was now getting the last answer. "I was present at one meeting," he said, "between Raffle and the contractor Rusk used. I didn't know what was being arranged. I understood afterward. And you said nothing," Silas said. "I was 29 years old, and I had just understood that my employer had been murdered by a man with significantly more resources than I had," Wynn said. His voice was level and precise and completely without apology. "I made a survival decision." "You made 11 years of survival decisions," Silas said. "Yes, inside my house. Yes." The space between them was not large, but it had the quality of something unbridgeable. Mara watched Silas's hands. She watched the way his weight shifted, the small readjustment that happened when a person moves from restraint to something underneath it. "The recording my father made," she said, cutting into the silence before it became something irreversible. "The one Rusk has. Where are the copies?" Wynn looked at her. "Why would I tell you that?" "Because Raffle's witness list exists. Your name is on it, and we are the only people in this city who are currently positioned to use it in a way that puts Rusk a federal prison, rather than in front of a Senate investigation that rolls over everyone on the list, including you." She held his gaze. "You want an exit. This is the only exit that exists. But it requires you to give us the recording for the gala tomorrow." "The gala is—" Wynn stopped. "You know about the gala," she said. "You told Rusk the plan to take me there. I passed along information about the estate's communications. I didn't specifically. The result is the same." She kept her voice even. "Rusk knows the gala is when he moves. He thinks he has the recording as insurance and a trap as the main operation. We need to take both of those away from him before tomorrow night." She paused. "How many copies of the recording exist?" Wynn looked at the wet concrete. He looked at Silas. He looked at the city below the parapet, the 10,000 windows of ordinary life arranged in grids of light. 3, he said. A master file on his private server, a physical drive at his residence, and a copy held by his attorney with instructions to release it in the event of Rusk's arrest or death. "The attorney," Mara said. "Who is it?" "A man named Forsyth. Gerald Forsyth. He practices out of an office in the Meridian building." Silas was very still. "Forsyth has been Rusk's attorney for how long?" 15 years. Wynn looked at him. He also handled certain aspects of the arrangement with the contractors. 12 years ago. He's not a neutral party. Then he's exposed too, Mara said. If we can get to him before the gala and make him understand that the Rafael Vera documentation creates a case that Forsyth's own file will be subpoenaed in, if he understands that holding Rusick's insurance policy makes him a co-conspirator, he'll hand over the copy, Silas said. He'll hand over the copy. She looked between them. "Can you reach him tonight?" "It's 11 o'clock, Wynn said. I know what time it is. Wynne was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a phone. Not the phone she'd seen him use in the house, a different one. And found a number and handed it to Mara. His private line. He answers it at any hour for clients he considers important. Am I an important client? Tell him Rafael Vere's name, Wynne said. That'll make you important. Forsyth answered on the second ring. Mara walked to the far end of the rooftop and stood at the parapet with the city laid out below her and the wet wind off the waterfront moving through her hair, and she said Rafael Vere's name into the phone and listened to the silence that followed it. Who is this? Forsyth said. He was trying for calm and not entirely achieving it. My name is Mara Bellamy, she said. I have the original financial documentation from Rafael Vere's personal records connecting Victor Rusk to the death of the Vere family 8 years ago. I have a witness list in Rafael's own handwriting identifying 7 individuals with direct knowledge of the transaction. And I'm going to give you 30 seconds to decide whether you want to be the attorney who helped us bring Rusk to justice, or the attorney whose name is on item 6 of that witness list. The silence was longer this time. Ms. Bellamy, Forsyth said carefully. Where are you? Close enough to meet you in the next 2 hours if you're willing. She watched the city. The copy of the recording you're holding for Rusk. I need it. In exchange, I will personally ensure that your name is characterized as that of an unwilling repository rather than a willing co-conspirator when this goes to federal prosecutors. That's the deal. It expires when I hang up. Another silence. She could hear him breathing, the particular breathing of a man doing rapid ethical arithmetic and finding on the numbers pointing in an unexpected direction. There's a parking structure near the Harmon building, he said. Level 2. I know the one, she said. 1 hour. She hung up and turned around. Silas was watching her from across the rooftop. Wynne was beside him, and the space between the two men had shifted from the unbridgeable quality of before to something more complicated, not trust, not even the beginning of it, pragmatic adjacency of people who needed each other for the next 18 hours. She walked back to them. Her shoes were wet from the concrete. Forsyth will meet us in an hour, she said. We get the attorney's copy tonight. Then we move on the server and the physical drive at Rusk's residence. The residence is guarded, Wynne said. How many? 8 men on rotation, plus interior security. Can they be redirected? She looked at him directly. You're still Rusk's man as far as he knows. Can you create a reason for the exterior rotation to be elsewhere for 20 minutes? Wynne considered this with the expression of a man measuring his own nerve. I can manufacture a threat credible enough to pull the exterior detail. There's an ongoing situation on the east side, a territorial dispute that Rusk has been monitoring. I can escalate the intelligence on that threat in a way that reads authentic. He paused. But if it goes wrong, we're all having a very bad night anyway, Mara said. It's not a worse outcome than the one we're currently aimed at. Wynne looked at Silas. Silas looked at Wynne. 11 years of manufactured trust and actual betrayal, and one witness list between them. And whatever passed across that space in those 3 seconds was not forgiveness, and was not resolution, and was not anything that had a clean name. It was just 2 men deciding whether the immediate problem was large enough to temporarily suspend the other problem. All right, Wynne said. The Forsyth meeting went fast. The attorney arrived at level 2 with the expression of a man who had rehearsed composure and was wearing it badly. He was in his 60s, well-maintained in the way that expensive professional success maintains people, with a briefcase that he set on the hood of a car and opened with hands that were steadier than his eyes. The drive was in a sealed envelope. He handed it over like it was something hot. The arrangement with Rusk's estate attorney specifies automatic release upon his arrest or death, Forsyth said. This copy going to you doesn't neutralize that mechanism. We'll deal with the estate attorney separately, Silas said. I'll need documentation that I cooperated, fully and voluntarily, Forsyth said. You'll get it. Silas took the envelope. After. Forsyth opened his mouth, then closed it again. Whatever calculation he ran returned the same answer as before. He got back in his car and drove away, and Mara watched his taillights and thought about all the Gerald Forsythes of the world, the men who made one bad decision for a client and then spent 15 years managing its consequences and called it a legal career. They moved on Rusk's residence at 2 in the morning. Wynn's manufactured intelligence about the East Side threat pulled the exterior rotation at 1:45. They had 18 minutes, which turned out to be 14 by the time the interior alarm system produced an unexpected complication. A secondary wireless signal that Wynn hadn't known about triggered when the kitchen entrance was breached. Silas's men had the physical drive in 11 minutes. Server access took 3 more. They were out with 90 seconds to spare before the exterior detail returned. Mara was in the car 2 blocks away with Devi, and she sat and waited and did not look at her phone and did not allow herself to think about what happened if those 90 seconds closed too early. Car door opened. Silas got in. He was breathing harder than usual, which was the most visible sign of exertion she'd seen from him. And he had a hard drive case in his hand. "The server?" she asked. "Wiped and physically destroyed." He caught his breath. "The drive." He held it up. "We have all 3 copies." She closed her eyes for 3 seconds. Just 3. Then she opened them. "Rusk doesn't know yet." "No. We have until tomorrow night before he finds out." "Yes. Then we have what we need, and we have the gala in approximately 18 hours, and we still need a plan for what happens when Rusk's men take me there." She paused, assuming we're still doing it that way. Silas looked at her in the dark of the car, with the city moving past the windows and his breathing returning to its normal register. And she saw the calculation running. And this time she watched it arrive at something different than before. Not just assessment, not just the cold arithmetic of operational decision-making, but something with an edge she recognized because she'd felt it herself on a rooftop an hour ago when she'd made a phone call she wasn't sure would work. "We're still doing it," he said. "Okay." She looked at the drive in his hand. "Then tomorrow night, Rusk meets his evidence. And we make sure there's no version of this where he walks away from it." From the front seat, the driver navigated a wet intersection, and the headlights of the city swept across them, and then away. And somewhere across that city, Calder Wynn was driving back to the estate to spend the last night of his double life, pretending to be who he'd pretended to be for 11 years. And somewhere Victor Rusk was sleeping, without knowing what had been taken from his house, and the gala was less than 20 hours away. Mara looked at the hard drive. Everything they needed was there. The recordings, the financial documentation, the witness list, the confession her father would make and had been made to understand he would make or face what came without it. The entire architecture of 8 years of murder and manipulation and manufactured debt, contained in drives and papers and a dead man's handwriting. And then Silas's phone rang. He answered it, said nothing for 15 seconds. His face changed in a way she'd never seen it change before, a crack running through the composure, not visible to someone who hadn't spent 9 days learning to read, a face that showed almost nothing. He ended the call. "What?" Mara said. "The gala," he said. "Rusk moved it." "What do you mean moved it?" "He's not waiting for tomorrow." Silas looked at her, and the crack in his face had closed back over, but she'd seen it, and she knew now what was underneath it, not fear. Something worse than fear. The expression of a man who has just understood that the trap he thought he was setting has been mirrored. The Harmon Foundation event has been rerouted. New location, new time. He looked at his watch in 6 hours, stared at him. "He knows," Silas said. "He knows we moved on the residence. He knows about the copies." His jaw was set and his voice was flat, and his hands were very still on the hard drive case. "He's been watching us." "Wynn," she said. "Wynn's been in the car with my people since we left the rooftop," Silas said. "Couldn't have. Not tonight." Something cold and certain was moving through her. Not Wynn. Someone else. She was thinking fast, threading back through the last 9 days every conversation, every room, every person who had been present. The jammer. In the library. "When we first talked about the plan, I had it running. Did you have it running the day before, when you told me about Wynn? When I found the ledger?" She looked at him. "Before you knew to use it." The silence was very long and very specific. "There's a second person," she said. "Someone else in your organization who's been feeding Rusk information. Someone we haven't identified. Someone who was present from the beginning." She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. "And they just told Rusk that we have the recordings." Outside the car windows, the city moved through its ordinary darkness, indifferent and enormous, and 6 hours was not very much time, and the plan they'd spent 9 days building had just been broken in half by a person whose name she didn't know. And in 6 hours, Victor Rusk was going to try to take her in a new location, the new variables, puzzles, and the one thing she'd had preparation was gone. Picked up her notebook. She turned to a clean page. She started writing. She found out at 7 in the morning. Pietro had gone to get them both coffee from the kitchen down the hall, and she was alone in the security suite with the copied files and the original drive, and the 4 monitors showing the building's exterior in the cold pre-dawn gray, and her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. 3 words and a file attachment. The 3 words were, "Check the name." She opened the attachment. It was a single document, 1 page, cleaner than the scanned PDFs on her mother's drive, formatted like a corporate registration filing. Top, Moretti Capital Holdings LLC Principal Officer. Below that, a name and a signature date. The name was Lucian Dominic Moretti. The signature date was 14 months before her mother died. She sat with that for 30 seconds. Exactly 30 seconds. Because she counted them the way she sometimes counted breaths when the thing she was feeling was too large to process all at once, and she needed to break it into units she could manage. Then Pietro came back with the coffee and looked at her face and set both cups down very carefully on the desk. "What happened?" he said. She turned the phone toward him. He read it. His face did something complicated that lasted about 2 seconds before he locked it back down. "Where did this come from?" "Unknown number." She took the phone back. "Pietro, tell me what you know about Moretti Capital Holdings." He was quiet for a moment. That was 1 beat too long. The legitimate arm. The clean side of the operation. Lucian restructured it 3 years ago when he took full control from his father's estate. 3 years ago. She looked at the signature date on the document. This filing is from 5 years ago. Before the restructure, before Lucian's father died, she held his gaze, which means this entity existed under Lucian's name, before he supposedly built the clean operation, which means either the document is fabricated, or Lucian has been lying about when and how he built it, or she stopped, picked up the coffee, put it back down without drinking it, or the clean operation was never clean. Pietro sat down in the chair across from her. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor for a moment, and she watched the quality of that, the specific way a man sits when he is deciding how much to say. "I've worked for this family for 11 years, he said finally. "I was here before Lucian took over. I was here when his father ran things, in a way that Lucian has spent the last 3 years trying to dismantle." He looked up. "What I know is that the old structure had layers that not everyone understood, including, I think, Lucian himself when he first came in. Are you telling me he might not have known what he was inheriting? I'm telling you, inheritance is complicated when the person leaving it didn't want you to understand all of it." He paused. "And I'm telling you that document could mean 6 different things, and whoever sent it to you wanted you to read it as one specific thing." Stared at him. Then she said, "Adler is in this building." "Yes. He was here last night. He's still here this morning." She stood up. "What did Lucian tell you about why Adler came back?" Pietro hesitated. "Follow up on Gala Security. Adler doesn't do security logistics. That's not what he is." She was already moving toward the door. "Where is Lucian right now?" "Main room, I think. Or his office." She walked out of the security suite and down the hallway at a pace that was just below running, because running would mean she'd lost control of the situation, and she had not lost control of the situation. She was simply moving very fast toward a conversation that could not wait. Pushed through the door to the main room. Lucian was at his desk. Adler was in the chair across from it. Both men looked up when she came in, and she read their faces in the half-second before either of them arranged their expressions. Lucian's had something in it that looked like the specific tension of a man who had been discussing something he wasn't finished with, and Adler's had nothing in it at all, which was itself the tell. She set her phone on the desk between them, face up, the document visible. "Explain this," she said. Lucian looked at the screen. Something moved through his face recognition, she thought, and then something harder. He picked up the phone, looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it back down. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Unknown number." 20 minutes ago, she held his gaze. "Is it real?" A pause. "The entity is real. The signature is real. He leaned back in his chair, and she watched him do it. Watched him make the decision to be still, to control the physical space, to not let the conversation run faster than he could manage. Context is not what it looks like. Then tell me the context. Lucian. Adler's voice even and measured. This doesn't need to happen now. She turned to look at Adler directly for the first time, since she'd found the memo with his name on it. She looked at him the way she'd been looking at everyone in this building, reading the details, the quality of the stillness, the gap between the surface and what was underneath. You signed a memo, she said, 11 days before my mother died, recommending immediate action to prevent her from forwarding documents to an auditor. She kept her voice flat. I have the document. I have copies in 3 locations. So whatever you are about to say to Lucian about what doesn't need to happen now, it does. It needs to happen right now. The room was very quiet. Adler looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Lucian, and the thing that passed between them in that look was something she'd been trained her whole professional life to read in the spaces between stated facts, the structural load that wasn't in the blueprints but was holding the building up anyway. Adler said, I think you should tell her. Lucian was quiet for 4 full seconds. Counted those 2. Then he said, Project Larkspur wasn't mine. The entity was used in my name without my knowledge. By my father before he died as part of a structure designed to make it look like the organization's criminal activity originated from me rather than from him. He held her gaze. When I found out, 18 months ago, I started dismantling it. Adler was part of the team that identified the full scope of it. She looked at him. Adler signed the memo that killed my mother. No. Lucian said it quietly and without flinching. Adler's signature was on a memo that was circulated to Project Larkspur participants. He received it the same way the others did. He did not write it. He did not authorize the action. Then who did? Lucian looked at her steadily. The memo originated from the same person who structured the entity in my name. Who built the entire Larkspur architecture? Who, when my father became inconvenient, arranged for the liability to transfer to me? He paused. My uncle Matteo drafted that memo. He signed it with Adler's name because Adler was the only participant who had expressed reservations about the direction the project was taking. It was meant to implicate him, to ensure his silence. She absorbed this. The room was so quiet, she could hear the ventilation system. She looked at Adler, who was looking back at her with the expression of a man who had been carrying something for a very long time. You knew, she said to him. You knew your name was on it. Yes. His voice was even. And I've spent 18 months working with Lucian to build the evidentiary case against Matteo that would make that memo mean what it actually means, rather than what it looks like. She looked back at Lucian, the name at the top of the Larkspur participant list. That was your father's doing. Yes. And Matteo has been using it as leverage over you. The moment I took over the organization, Matteo had a file that could make it look like I was the architect of everything Project Larkspur did, including what happened to your mother. He held her gaze and did not look away from it. That is why I needed the evidence your mother hid, not just to expose Matteo, but to prove the chain of authorization, to prove the memo came from him, that the entity was built by him in my name, that every action taken under the Larkspur structure was his direction and not mine. He paused. That is what I didn't tell you on the first night. Not because I wanted to deceive you. Because telling you meant trusting you with the one piece of information that, if it reached the wrong person, would end any chance of exposing him. Stood at the desk for a long moment. Her hands were at her sides. She was breathing carefully in and out, managing the thing in her chest that wanted to be something she couldn't afford right now. And the document someone just sent to my phone. Matteo. Adler said it with certainty. He knows you have the drive. He knows what's on it. He's trying to discredit the evidentiary value before you can use it by making you believe Lucian's guilt is on the record, so that when the full file comes out, you appear to be a witness who was manipulated by the accused. She turned and walked to the window. Manhattan was fully awake out there, gray and indifferent and enormous. Pressed the back of her hand against the cold glass and felt her own pulse against it, fast and insistent. The gala is tomorrow night, she said. Yes, Lucian said. Matteo will be there. Warren will be there. She turned back around. He sent that document this morning because he's trying to destabilize me before tomorrow, which means he's worried. She looked at Lucian. He wouldn't bother trying to destabilize me if he thought he already had control of the situation. Something shifted in Lucian's expression. Not quite relief. Something more complicated. No, he wouldn't. So we go. She crossed her arms. And we go in, knowing he's going to move at the gala. Not after it. During it. That's our read. Then I need today. She held his gaze. I need today to go through every remaining file on that drive. And I need Adler to walk me through the evidentiary chain he's been building for 18 months. All of it. Because if I'm walking into that room tomorrow night, I am not doing it half-informed. Adler looked at Lucian. Lucian nodded once. All right, Adler said. And then with something in his voice that was not quite an apology but was in that territory, your mother's reservations were the reason I began documenting what Matteo was doing. I want you to know that. She looked at him. Then help me finish what she started. They worked through the day without stopping. Adler laid out the evidentiary structure on the main table physical documents. Digital files cross-referenced to the material on her mother's drive, timeline that stretched from the first Larkspur transaction in 2018 to the server access attempt 3 nights ago. He worked with the precision of a man who had built this architecture carefully and over a long time, and she matched it with her own precision, pushing back when something didn't align, asking questions he had to think about before he answered, finding 3 places where the chain of documentation had gaps that a defense attorney would attack. They filled 2 of the 3 gaps, using files from her mother's drive that Adler hadn't had access to. The 3rd gap was a missing wire transfer confirmation that connected Matteo's personal accounts to the operational fund that had financed the surveillance on her mother in the weeks before her death. If we don't have that transfer record, Vivienne said, looking at the gap in the timeline, the chain from Matteo to the action is circumstantial. Yes, Adler said. Who would have it? Adler was quiet for a moment. The originating bank. But the account was closed 3 years ago. Banks keep records for 7 years minimum under federal law. She was already pulling her laptop toward her. What was the bank? It was a private institution. Summit Private. She typed it, looked at the results. Summit Private had been acquired by a larger regional bank in 2021, which meant its records had been absorbed into the acquiring institution's archive system, which meant they existed, which meant they were accessible. Theoretically, through the right legal channel, specifically a federal subpoena, which she did not have and could not obtain before tomorrow night. There's another way, Wren said from the doorway. He'd been there for the last 2 hours, quiet, listening. She'd forgotten he was there. He stepped into the room. Summit's acquisition was handled by a firm that I know has a records access division. I have a contact there. He looked at Lucian. It would take money, and it would take tonight. Do it, Lucian said. Wren left. The work continued. At 6 in the evening, she stood up and pressed both fists into the small of her back and stretched until something cracked. And Lucian, across the table, looked up from the document he was reading. Eat something, he said. In a minute now. You haven't eaten since. I said in a minute. She sat back down. The gala's venue, the Soren building. Who controls the physical security for the event? We share it with the venue's own team. Matteo will know that. He'll have someone placed in the venue team. She looked up. We need to assume that anything we plan for tomorrow night is potentially visible to him, which means we can't plan openly. Lucian looked at her for a moment. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we don't tell anyone outside this room what the actual plan is. She held his gaze. Including people in your organization who don't absolutely need to know. Silence. She watched him. What that meant the implication that the leak, whatever and wherever it was, could be inside the operation. He'd been avoiding that conclusion, she thought. Not from naivety, but from the specific difficulty of accepting that the breach was close. Yes, he said. All right, the evidence goes with me tomorrow night. The original and all 3 copies. She paused. I want to be the one to present it. Vivienne, the chain of custody, she said. I'm the one who received the drive from my mother. I'm the one who authenticated the documents. A federal investigator looking at this evidentiary package needs to see an unbroken chain of possession, And I am that chain. She held his gaze. And I'm the one Mateo has been underestimating. Which means I'm the one he won't watch him carefully enough when it matters. Lucian looked at her for a long time. The room was quiet around them. Adler studying the table, the city going dark outside the windows. She watched Lucia's face move through something she couldn't fully read, something that had layers in it, something old and complicated that had nothing to do with strategy. All right, he said. You're the one who presents it. The gala began at 8. The Sorin Building's ballroom was on the 44th floor, and by 8:15 it held 160 people in formal clothes, moving through the particular choreography of events like this, the handshakes, the glasses lifted and lowered, the conversations that were performing other conversations. Kind of room where every surface was polished and nothing was what it announced itself to be. She wore a midnight blue dress she'd bought that afternoon from a boutique 3 blocks from the building, because she hadn't packed anything appropriate and she refused to borrow from anyone in the penthouse. The dress had clean lines and no embellishment, and she felt solid in it, which was what mattered. She wore her mother's watch on her left wrist. The thumb drive was in a slim interior pocket. She'd had the boutique seamstress add in an hour while she waited, stitched against her ribs on the left side. She walked in on Lucian's arm. He was in black, no tie, and moved through the room the way he moved everywhere, with the economy of someone who knew exactly where everything was. She could feel the tension in his forearm, where her hand rested controlled, present, barely detectable. She matched it with her own. Warren Ashford found her 20 minutes in. He came across the room with his arms already opening for an embrace, and she let him hug her, because pulling away would have been visible, pressed her cheek briefly against his, and said his name warmly, and stepped back and looked at his face. Warren was 6'61", tan, with the easy confidence of a man who had always had money and had never seriously believed it could leave him. He was smiling at her with genuine affection, and that the fact that it was genuine was the worst thing about it. "I've been so worried," he said. "Your father told me you were well. He said it was complicated." "It was," she said. "It's less complicated now." He glanced at Lucian beside her. Something moved behind his eyes, not alarm, not yet, but an assessment, a recalibration. "I didn't realize the arrangement was real," she smiled. She'd practiced the smile. "It is." Lucian extended his hand to Warren. Warren took it. She watched their hands grip and release, and read the duration of it a half-beat too, short on Warren's side, the handshake of a man who wanted it over. She excused herself 10 minutes later, citing the bar. Lucian let her go, with a single look that communicated 6 things at once, most of which translated roughly to be careful. She gave him a look back that she hoped communicated, "I know what I'm doing," though she was less certain of that than she wanted to be. She found Matteo Moretti at the bar. She had seen his photograph in the folder, and the photographs had prepared her for a man who looked like authority, which he did, but differently than she'd expected. He was 64, heavier than Lucian, with silver hair worn longer than most men his age, and the kind of face that had been handsome once, and had settled into something harder. He was holding a glass of scotch and talking to a man she didn't recognize, and when she came to stand beside him at the bar, his attention moved to her with the smooth, unhurried precision of a man who had been aware of her exact location in the room for the last 40 minutes. "Mrs. Moretti," he said. The title landed with a weight she hadn't anticipated. "Mr. Moretti." She ordered a sparkling water, kept her hand still. He looked at her with an expression of warmth that was perfectly constructed and utterly hollow underneath. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. My nephew has kept you very private." "He has," she agreed. "Understandable. Given the circumstances." He paused, letting the weight of circumstances sit in the air. "Your family has been through a great deal." "Yes." She looked at him directly. "It has." He held her gaze. She held his. She was looking for the thing underneath the calculation the read he was doing on her, the assessment of what she knew, and how much of a problem she was. Kept her own surface completely smooth and let him look. "I hope," he said, pleasantly, "that you found the penthouse comfortable." "Very." She picked up her water. Lucian keeps good files. The pause before his next breath was imperceptible. Caught it anyway. "I'm sure he does." She smiled and moved away from the bar. Her heart was going at 140. maybe 150. The kind of pace that made her vision feel slightly sharpened at the edges. Crossed the room toward Lucian and got close enough to say quietly, without moving her lips much, "He knows. He's been watching me since I walked in, and he knows I found something." Lucian's jaw moved. "How long do we have?" She scanned the room. "Where is the contact?" "Northeast corner, dark jacket, no lapel pin." She found him a man in his early 40s, nondescript, holding a glass he hadn't drunk from. Federal investigator, placed there by the arrangement. Adler had spent 2 days coordinating through channels that Mateo's network wouldn't have visibility into. The arrangement that was the entire architecture of tonight. The controlled environment, the documented exposure, the chain of evidence presented in a room full of witnesses. Then she saw something that put ice in her stomach. Soren Adler, who was supposed to be upstairs, coordinating the secondary documentation transfer, was standing in the southeast corner of the room, in conversation with a man she recognized from the folder, one of Mateo's outer circle. They were standing close, speaking low, and Adler's posture was wrong. Not the posture of a man managing a tense situation, but the posture of a man receiving instructions. "Turn back to Lucian." "Adler," she said. His eyes found Adler across the room. She watched something happen in his face, the specific internal collapse of a conclusion he'd been resisting, arriving all at once. "No," he said, and his voice had something ragged in the single syllable. "Yes." She kept her voice absolutely level, which means the contact in the northeast corner may already be compromised. She held his gaze. "Lucian, look at me." He looked. His face was very controlled, but his eyes were doing something she'd never seen in them before. "The evidence is here. I have it. The chain of custody is intact. We can still do this tonight, but it has to be now, before Adler moves, before Mateo has time to Pinets." The lights went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dim. Full immediate blackout, every light in the 44th floor ballroom gone simultaneously, replaced by the ambient glow of the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows, which turned the room from a controlled social environment into something with no clear edges, no certain geography. 160 people suddenly blind and beginning to make the noise that people make when something had become something else entirely. She felt Lucian's hand close around her wrist in the dark. His grip was firm and specific, not restraining, locating. She gripped back. "Move," he said, close to her ear. "Where?" "Northeast." The contact. They moved. The room was chaos in the specific way of crowds and sudden darkness. People reaching for phones. Voices elevated. The sound of a glass breaking somewhere to the left. She stayed close to Lucian, one hand in his, the other pressed to her ribs where the drive sat against her skin. 10 steps. 15. Someone moved through the crowd against their direction, and she felt hands not accidental, not the blind contact of a panicked stranger, but deliberate. Searching, reaching toward her left side. Twisted hard, pulling away, and the hands caught the fabric of her dress for a second, before releasing, and she said Lucian's name in a voice that was sharp and not loud enough to carry, and he pulled her closer, and they kept moving. The emergency lighting came on 30 seconds after the main lights went out, dim, red-tinged, enough to resolve the room back into shapes. She could see the northeast corner. The man in the dark jacket was still there, but his posture had changed. He was alert now, not observing, scanning the room with the particular attention of someone who had been told something was about to happen. She was 12 feet from him when she saw Matteo Moretti moving through the crowd from the opposite direction. Not panicked, not disoriented, moving with calm, directional purpose toward the same point in the northeast corner, and she understood in that instant that the blackout was his, that this was the move, the aggressive play, the thing Pietro had called closing, and that Matteo was going to reach the federal contact before they did, and do whatever he'd planned to do to neutralize him. She let go of Lucian's hand. Vivian, she moved, not toward Matteo, diagonally, cutting through the crowd on a line that would intersect with the contact. Before, Matteo reached him, using the crowd itself as cover the way she'd moved through a construction site, reading the gaps and the sight lines, and taking the fastest path that wasn't a straight line. Someone grabbed her arm, she pulled through it. Someone stepped in front of her, she went around. She reached the contact with 4 seconds to spare. put the drive in his hand and said, "Low and fast, Vivian Ashford. Chain of custody from Elena Ashford, deceased. 37 files, authenticated. The memo is file 22. She closed his fingers around it. Matteo Moretti is 6 feet behind me, and he knows what I just gave you. The contact looked at her, then past her. His expression shifted into something professional and absolute. He reached into his jacket, and behind her, Matteo Moretti said her name. Turned. He was standing 3 feet away, and the warmth was gone from his face. Now the constructed cordiality, the pleasant performance, all of it stripped back to what was underneath, which was something old and cold and entirely convinced of its own primacy. He was looking at her the way powerful men look at something that has gotten in the way of something they consider theirs. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what you've just done." She held his gaze in the red emergency light, with the city spread out 50 floors below them, and 160 witnesses in the room around them, and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. And she said, "Yes, I do." 6 hours. Mara wrote that at the top of the clean page and underlined it, and then stopped underlining, because underlining was something you did when you had time to emphasize things, and she didn't. Fast. Not elegantly, this was not a document. It was thinking made visible, the way she'd always worked through problems that were too large and too tangled to hold entirely in her head. Boxes and arrows and names connected by lines. The new location. The things they knew and the things they didn't. The second informant, unnamed, unidentified, somewhere in the architecture of Silas's organization, like a fault line that had been there the whole time. Invisible until the ground moved. Silas was on his phone in the front seat, talking in the low, clipped register of a man issuing instructions that had to be exactly right. She could hear the controlled urgency in his voice without making out the words. The driver navigated without asking where they were going, which told her they were being routed back to the estate or to one of the properties, and she let the destination resolve itself and kept writing. The second informant had been present from the beginning. That was the operating assumption, and it had to be right because the alternative that Rusk had surveillance, coverage, sophisticated enough to capture conversations, even with a jammer running, was worse and less actionable. Person. Someone who'd been in the house for the first 9 days. Someone with access to the library, to the rooms, to the information flow. She wrote a list of everyone she'd interacted with in the estate. Silas, Devi, Calder Wynn. 3 other men she'd seen repeatedly enough to catalog a man named Harrow, who ran the household security rotation, a younger man who drove and occasionally relayed messages, a woman who cleaned and had never made eye contact. She stared at the list. Then she turned to Devi, who was sitting beside her with the thermos, and the expression of someone who had survived worse nights than this, through the application of extreme stillness. "Devi," Mara said. "The day before Silas and I first talked in the library, the day I found the ledger, who knew I'd been given access to that room?" Devi looked at her. "Mr. Vare announced general house access the morning of your 3rd day. Who was present when he announced it?" "The usual morning staff briefing. Myself, Harrow, the 2 primary household staff, and..." Devi stopped. "And who Mr. Wynn attended that morning?" "He had a scheduling question." Devi's face remained carefully neutral. "And Petra? Who is Petra?" "She handles correspondence and scheduling. She's been with the household for 3 years. Mara looked at Silas's back. "Does Petra attend the morning briefings regularly?" Silas had ended his call. He'd been listening. "No," he said. He turned halfway in the seat. "She doesn't. She would have had to have a specific reason to be there. Or she was told to be there," Mara said. "To hear that I'd been given library access. To hear what general access meant in terms of where I'd be moving through the house." She looked at the list in her notebook. "Where is Petra now?" The car went quiet in a particular way. "I'll find out," Harrow said from the driver's seat, and reached for his radio. Petra was not at the estate. She had not been at the estate since approximately 10 that evening, which was approximately 1 hour after Mara and Silas had left for the rooftop meeting with Wynn. She had told the remaining household staff she had a family emergency. She had taken nothing visible from her workspace, which was the detail that told Mara the most people leaving, for genuine emergencies, took things, keys and phones, and the minimum necessary. People leaving because they'd been told to leave took nothing because they'd prepared in advance. They had the second informant's name. They did not have the second informant. And Rusk had everything Petra had told him, which was enough to know the plan, to know the copies had been retrieved, to know that in 6 hours they would be arriving somewhere different from the original gala venue with variables he controlled, and they didn't. New location, Mara said. They were in the estate situation room, a room she hadn't been in before, functional and spare, with a large table and screens and the kind of lighting that said this space existed for exactly this kind of problem. He moved the gala venue. What's the new location? Silas's man, a compact, careful-spoken person named Adler, who had appeared at some point in the last hour, and seemed to be responsible for the kind of information that took effort to obtain, pulled up a map on the center screen. The Harmon Foundation rerouted their event announcement 40 minutes ago. New venue is the Caldwell Waterfront Complex, formerly a warehouse facility, converted to event space 2 years ago. Mara looked at the map. The Caldwell complex sat at the working end of the city's waterfront, not the renovated, tourist-facing end with restaurants and promenades, but the older section where the docks still handled cargo, and the architecture was industrial, and the nearest residential building was 4 blocks away. A location chosen for isolation, for the ability to move people and vehicles without civilian witnesses. He's not hosting a charity gala, she said. He never was. The gala was always just the mechanism, the public event, that gives people a reason to be in a location without explaining their presence. At the original venue, there'd have been other guests, actual foundation donors, people who'd notice things. She turned to Silas. At Caldwell, he controls who's there, which means he's dropping the pretense. He knows we know, Silas said. He knows we know, and he doesn't care anymore. He's moving to force resolution. She looked at the waterfront map and felt the specific cold clarity of a situation that had run out of indirection. He's not taking me to get the documents. He's taking me to demonstrate to you that he can. And then, she stopped. And then he uses me as leverage to make Silas surrender the recordings, she said. He doesn't need the recordings to destroy the VAIR organization anymore. He needs Silas to hand them over voluntarily, which he does if I'm the alternative. She looked at Silas. That's the play, not the evidence. Me. Silas was looking at the map. His jaw was set and his hands were flat on the table, and she knew him well enough. By now 9 days was apparently sufficient to learn a person's baseline, which said something, either about duration or intensity, or both, to read the quality of that stillness. He's betting I'll trade the evidence for you, Silas said. Would you? The question landed in the room and nobody moved. No, Silas said. And then, with a precision that was not coldness, but something more complicated, which is why we're not putting you in a position where that's the question being asked. I'm already in that position, Mara said. We've been in it since the car. The only variable is whether we arrive at Caldwell on Rusk's terms or ours. She put both hands flat on the map. So tell me what assets you have, and we'll figure out what ours look like. The next 4 hours were the most concentrated work Mara had ever done in her life, and she had once spent 72 consecutive hours finishing a thesis chapter during a power outage using a flashlight and handwritten notes, so her baseline for concentrated work was not low. They had 6 people they trusted completely after. Petra Adler, Harrow, 2 men named Costa and Reeves, who had been with Silas's organization for over a decade, and whose loyalty Wynne grudgingly confirmed, Devi, who was apparently something more than a household manager in a crisis, and Wynne himself, who was operating under no illusions about the nature of the trust being extended to him, and was, Mara suspected, performing better under these conditions than he had in years, because there was something clarifying about having only one option. They had the recordings, the documents, and her father's confession, which had been recorded at the restaurant before the window exploded, and the chaos began, and had captured exactly what Mara had needed: the admission of financial access, the information transfers, the knowledge of what the documents contained. Confession was not clean or pretty. Her father had cried during parts of it. She had not been in the room for those parts, but she'd heard it through the door, and the sound had moved through her, like something irrevocable, the sound of a man dismantling the last version of himself that he'd been able to maintain. She'd put it away. There would be time for that later. There wasn't time for it now. At 3:45 in the morning, Adler produced the architectural plans for the Caldwell complex obtained through direct channels. Mara did not ask about from a city planning database that was theoretically not accessible to private parties. The complex was a converted warehouse structure, approximately 12,000 square feet of main event floor with 2 secondary spaces, loading dock access on the south end, a mezzanine level running the perimeter, and a connected annex that had been added during the conversion. The annex had a separate entrance. The annex was the detail. He'll have the main floor controlled, Mara said. Primary entrance, loading docks, mezzanine. His people positioned before anyone arrives. If he's inviting anyone as cover, if he's maintaining even the surface layer of the galafiction, they'll be in the main space. She traced the annex connection with her finger. The annex is where he'll take me. It's separated enough to be private and connected enough to be fast. He'll have it guarded, Harrow said. Yes, but he'll have it guarded for someone he's expecting to take by force, not for someone who arrives on their own terms. She looked at Silas. I go in through the main entrance with the gala attendees. I give Rusk's people exactly what they're expecting a woman they can take when the moment is right. I let them move me to the annex. She paused. And I bring the evidence with me. The room was very quiet. You're using yourself as the delivery system, Silas said. I'm using the expectation of what I am as cover, she said. He expects a woman being maneuvered. He doesn't expect a woman who knows the floor plan and has already decided what happens in the annex. What happens in the annex, Wynne said. He presents his terms. I present the evidence. She looked at them. On record, Adler. Can you set up a live transmission from a device small enough to be concealed? Adler looked at her. From what to what? From wherever I'm wearing it to somewhere outside the building. Somewhere that can relay to a federal receiver. The silence this time had a different texture. You're going to stream a live confession from Victor Rusk, Silas said. I'm going to give him an audience he doesn't know he has, Mara said. He's going to tell me what he wants. He's going to tell me what he's willing to do to get it. He's going to explain, because men like Rusk always explain, why he's the one who should be standing where he's standing. She looked at Silas steadily, and when he's done explaining, I'm going to show him what we have, and his options are going to be exactly 2. Surrender or escalate, Silas said. Surrender or escalate in front of a live federal transmission. She paused. He's not a man who surrenders, but he'll escalate in a building where you are already inside. In positions he doesn't know about. With Wynne's access codes disabling the perimeter security, at the moment I show him the evidence. She looked around the table, at Adler with his maps and his careful expression, at Harrow with his operational precision, at Wynne who was looking at his hands, at Devi who was looking at Mara with the first expression she'd shown all night that wasn't carefully managed, something that might have been. In a different face, something close to respect. At Silas, who was looking at her with the particular quality of a man who had stopped trying to make her smaller than she was. It's a good plan, Wynne said. He said it like it cost him something, with about 4 points where it fails catastrophically. Name them, Mara said. 1. The transmission gets detected before you reach the annex. 2. Rusk doesn't explain anything and goes straight to force. 3. The federal receiver. He stopped. You actually have a federal receiver. Adler, Mara said. Adler reached into his jacket and put a card on the table. It had a name and a federal agency seal. I've been in contact with an investigator for the last six months, he said. Off protocol. She's been building a parallel case against Rusk from the financial side. She doesn't have the murder documentation, but she has enough to want it. Badly enough to sit outside the Caldwell complex in an unmarked vehicle at 4 in the morning. If I call her in the next hour. Silas looked at Adler for a long moment. You've been running a federal contact for 6 months. You told me 4 months ago to handle the Rusk's problem, Adler said. I was handling it. Another long moment. Then something passed across Silas's face that was not quite amusement, but occupied the same general territory. Call her, he said. Mara dressed for the gala at 5:30 in the morning, in a room she'd been living in for 9 days, and had never quite felt was hers, which was appropriate because it had never been hers, and she was choosing not to feel things about that right now. Devi had produced, from somewhere, a dress that was appropriate for a charity event and dark enough not to read as an obvious color under bad lighting. Mara put it on and thought about the last time she'd dressed for a formal event, a faculty reception, 18 months ago, with her thesis half done and her biggest problem being a difficult committee member. And the distance between that night and this one was not measurable in any unit she had. The transmitter was the size of a button and went under the dress's fabric at the neckline. Adler had tested it twice. The investigator, a woman named Chen, who had the voice of someone who had been doing surveillance work long enough to be unsurprisable, confirmed receipt from the vehicle position, 3 blocks from the Caldwell complex. Silas came in at 5:45. He stopped in the doorway, which he didn't usually do. He usually just entered and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly and landed on something that didn't have a name and didn't need one. "The transmitter's good?" he said. Adler checked it twice. "Check it once more." He crossed the room and stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he reached up and pressed 2 fingers lightly to the fabric at the neckline. And she was aware, with the particular inconvenient awareness of someone who had been in close quarters with a person for 9 days, under conditions of sustained high stress, that this was the first time he'd touched her since the marriage contract. "Good," he said. "I know." He didn't step back immediately. She didn't step back either. "If something goes wrong in there," he said, "then you come in faster. That's not." He stopped. Started again. "I don't do this. Send people into buildings alone?" "Care," he said. Simply. One word, no architecture around it. Just the word standing in the room taking whatever came. She looked at him. 9 days. A debt that wasn't real. A marriage that wasn't a marriage. A man who had looked at her in a hallway like she was furniture in the wrong room, and had been quietly and systematically revising that assessment every day since. "I know," she said again. "I'll be careful." "You'll be reckless," he said. "You have been from the beginning. I'm asking you to be reckless, in a way that keeps you alive." "I can do that," she said. He stepped back. She picked up the small bag that contained, among other things, a USB drive with copies of every piece of evidence they had assembled, because the transmitter was live coverage and the drive was physical proof, and she was not walking into that building with only one form of leverage. Caldwell complex looked like what it was, an industrial building that had put on a tuxedo. String lighting along the exterior, a temporary entrance canopy, valets managing a modest line of cars. Whatever portion of the Harmon Foundation's gala had been real was real enough to have drawn approximately 60 people, most of whom were navigating the gap between charity event expectations and waterfront warehouse reality, with the gracious confusion of people who had already paid for their tickets. Mara went in at 6:42, alone. Silas and his people were already inside, or positioned around the exterior, or in the annex itself through the separate entrance. She didn't know the specific placements, because Harrow had said the less she knew about the operational positions, the more natural her behavior would be. And he was right. So she had agreed, and was now walking into a building with 60 civilians, an unknown number of Victor Rusk's men, and a live federal transmission running at her neckline. The main floor was exactly as the architectural plan had indicated. High ceilings, the bones of the warehouse still visible under the event dressing, a bar along the east wall, and tables arranged in the center, and the mezzanine level above, ringed with what she now understood were not event staff but positioning. She counted 4 men on the mezzanine inside 30 seconds. Their posture was wrong for hospitality. She took a glass of water from a passing tray and moved through the room, and did not look for Rusk directly, because looking for someone in a room like this was the thing that told them you knew they were there. She felt him before she saw him. The quality of the room's attention, the way certain people near the bar were oriented, not toward each other, but toward a point across the room. And she followed that orientation until she found it. Victor Rusk was 61, and looked it in the way that powerful men who have spent decades making other people afraid sometimes look it, not diminished by age but concentrated, the years compressing something rather than wearing it down. He was medium height, with thick gray hair, and the particular self-possession of a man who had walked into rooms knowing he owned them for so long that it had become a physical quality. He was talking to a foundation board member and not looking at Mara. He knew she was there. He was demonstrating that he didn't need to look. She moved to a position near the east wall. She let 12 minutes pass. She watched the room with the careful peripheral attention she'd been developing for 9 days. She identified 2 more of Rusk's men near the south access, and 1 more at the bar who was drinking water. 6:58, a woman touched her elbow from behind, Ms. Bellamy. The woman was in her 40s, unremarkable, with the steady eyes of someone who did this professionally. "Mr. Rusk would like a word. If you'd follow me." "Of course," Mara said. The annex connection was a corridor that smelled of the warehouse. It had been concrete and old metal, and the faint chemical ghost of industrial cleaning. The event dressing stopped at the corridor entrance. There was no string lighting back here, just fluorescent tubes, the same quality of light as the property management office, where she'd first understood how completely the plan could fail. Victor Rusk was already in the annex when she arrived. 2 men flanked the far door. 1 stood behind her as she entered. She counted the room, automatically 4 men plus Rusk. 1 entrance behind her, 1 across, the mezzanine above the main floor, not extending to this space. No sight lines from outside. "Ms. Bellamy," Rusk said. His voice was unremarkable, in-person moderate volume, no particular accent. The voice of a man who had learned that you didn't need to project to make people listen. "I appreciate you coming." "I was invited," she said. Something passed across his face, not a smile, just the register of someone who appreciated precision. "Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her. The 2 men stayed at the far door, and the one behind her stayed where he was, and nobody was overtly threatening, because overt threat was not Rusk's register. She understood that now. He was a man who preferred the threat to remain implicit until the moment he decided it shouldn't be. "You've had a busy 9 days," he said. "I've had an interesting 9 days," she said. "I learned a lot about debt structures and evidence collection, apparently." He folded his hands on the table. They were large hands, well kept. "The recordings from my residence, my attorney's copy. Very thorough work for someone who came to this situation as what was the term? An unwanted bride. I've been called worse, I'm sure." He looked at her steadily. "You understand what I'm going to ask you? You're going to ask me to have Silas Vare surrender the recordings and the Raphael documentation in exchange for my safe return to the estate," she said. "And you're going to suggest that if he doesn't, what happens to me will be demonstrative. That's an efficient summary. I'm an efficient person." She met his gaze. "Can I show you something first?" Rusk was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of a man who was not afraid of pauses. "Go ahead." She put the USB drive on the table. "That's everything," she said. "Raphael's financial records, the transaction documentation, the witness list, which includes, by the way, both Gerald Forsyth and Calder Wynne, neither of whom are in a position to be useful to you anymore. Confession, the recordings from your residence and your attorney." She paused. "And this conversation, which has been transmitted live to a federal investigator, sits 3 blocks from this building for the last 11 minutes. Rusk looked at the drive. His face did not visibly change. That was the most frightening thing about him, she thought, not the men at the doors, or the implicit threat, or the 11 years of orchestrated destruction. The face that didn't change. "You've made a significant effort," he said. "I had good help. Silas Vare is outside this building." "Yes." "With how many people enough?" She kept her voice level. "Mr. Rusk, I'm going to give you the same thing I gave Gerald Forsyth. 30 seconds to decide whether you want to walk out of this building with the assistance of a federal cooperation agreement or not walk out at all." The silence stretched. She counted heartbeats because it was something to count. Then Rusk smiled. It was the first time she'd seen him smile, and it was not a reassuring thing. "Ms. Bellamy," he said, "you came in here with a drive and a transmitter, and you think that's sufficient to close this." He looked at her with something that was almost genuine interest. "What you don't know, what Silas Vare doesn't know, is that the federal investigator you're transmitting to has been on my payroll for 2 years. The room went very cold. "Chen," Rusk said. "She's thorough, I'll give her that. She built a genuinely useful case against my operation over those 2 years, and delivered it to me in installments." He unfolded his hands. "Whatever you've been transmitting is going to a receiver in that vehicle. The vehicle is driven by one of my people. Chen herself is—" He paused. "Chen is no longer a variable." Mara's hands were flat on the table. She could feel her own pulse against the tabletop. She could feel the transmitter at her neckline, broadcasting into what was apparently a dead channel. Feel the 9 days of work reorganizing itself in her mind around this new weight, this new terrible fact, and she was very aware that her face was the only thing she had full control of right now. Kept it still. "That's your play," she said. "You bought the investigator." "I buy what's buyable," Rusk said. "It's a reliable system." He reached across the table and picked up the USB drive. "Thank you for consolidating this. It saves time." From behind her, she heard the far door open. Rusk looked up. His expression changed. The man at the far door was not one of his. Silas Vare walked into the annex, with Costa and Reeves flanking him, and the specific quality of intent that she had seen on him exactly once before, in a garden, right after someone had tried to shoot him, when he'd stood up from behind a stone bench with a gun in his hand, and the absolute economy of a man who had already decided what came next. "Victor," Silas said. Rusk's men moved. Costa and Reeves moved faster. The compressed violence of people who did this, rather than managed people who did this, and the room became extremely loud, extremely fast, contained acoustic disaster of a small space where 4 people were fighting and furniture was involved. Mara grabbed the USB drive from Rusk's hand across the table. He grabbed her wrist. She drove her elbow into his forearm with the force of someone who had spent 9 days deciding they were done, being maneuvered, and it connected hard enough to break his grip, and she was on her feet and moving toward Silas. Rusk was on his feet behind her. He had a gun. "Silas," she said. The room stopped, not because of her voice, because Rusk had the gun at her head, and the 2 men at the door were both down, and Costa had a cut above his eye that was running freely, and Reeves was holding his shoulder at an angle that said it wasn't right. And Silas was 3 meters away, with his own gun leveled at Rusk, and the annex was very small and very quiet. "This is where we are," Rusk said. He was breathing harder than he'd been at the table, but his voice was still that moderate, unremarkable volume. "Drop it, Silas." Silas did not drop it. He held Mara's eyes, for 1 second, 2, and she could see the calculation in him, the angles, the distances, fraction of a second. And she could also see the thing underneath the calculation. That was not calculation at all. And that was the problem, because it was going to make him hesitate. She could not let him hesitate. She moved. Not away from Rusk toward him, which was the only direction he wasn't prepared for, because the reasonable thing was away, and she had been done with reasonable since a parking garage in the financial district. She turned into the gun rather than away from it, and grabbed his wrist with both hands, and she felt the barrel scrape across her cheekbone, leaving a burn she'd deal with later, and she pulled down and forward with everything she had. The gun went off. The shot took the fluorescent tube above them. Glass rained. The room went to emergency half-dark. Silas crossed the 3 meters in 1 second. What happened next was fast and not clean, and she was on the floor with her ears ringing from the shot, and Rusk was against the wall, and Silas had him there with a forearm across his chest, and the gun was on the floor in the glass, and she sat in the middle of the annex floor in a formal dress with blood on her face from the tube glass and the USB drive in her hand, and she held it up and looked at it and exhaled. "The transmission," she said. Her voice was strange to her own ears, muffled from the shot. Chen was compromised. Rusk bought her. "I know," Silas said. He was still holding Rusk against the wall, and his voice was tight with effort. "Adler's been running a secondary transmission since we entered the building. Different receiver." She stared at him. "Different receiver. Adler doesn't run single points of failure," Silas said. "He built a backup contact 6 months ago. Someone Rusk hasn't reached yet." He looked at her across the room, across the glass and the dark and the wreckage of a plan that had broken and been rebuilt in the span of 4 hours. "It's all on record." She looked at the USB drive. She looked at Rusk against the wall, who was breathing hard and not speaking, for the first time since she'd met him, who was looking at her with an expression that was finally something other than controlled, something raw and unwilling. Face of a man encountering an outcome he hadn't designed. From outside the annex, she could hear shouting, movement, the controlled chaos of an operation in progress, Harrow's people moving through the main floor, the sound of the gala's civilian attendees being directed toward exits, and beneath all of that, growing, specific audio signature of vehicles arriving at the building's perimeter. Not Rusk's vehicles. Federal vehicles. The second receiver had worked. Mara stood up from the floor. She stood up carefully because her legs were less steady than she would have preferred, and she had glass in her hair, and her cheek was burning where the gun barrel had scraped it. She stood up, and she looked at Victor Rusk against the wall, the man who had built 8 years of murder and manipulation into an empire on the foundation of a dead family. And she held up the USB drive. "You bought the investigator," she said. Her voice was steadier now. "You didn't buy the backup." Rusk looked at her. Something moved in his face, the last calculation, running, arriving at its answer. "Who are you?" he said. Not a threat, almost genuine. "I'm the unwanted bride," she said. The federal agents came through both doors simultaneously. Federal agents moved through both doors with the particular efficiency of people who had been waiting outside a building for 40 minutes and were very ready to stop waiting. Mara stood in the center of the annex with glass in her hair and blood drying on her cheek and the USB drive in her hand, and she watched them come in, and she felt something she hadn't felt in 9 days, which was the specific physical sensation of a situation moving out of her hands. Not collapse, not relief, just transfer. The weight lifting from her grip and going somewhere institutional, somewhere with procedures and forms and chains of custody, and her body registering the shift, the way a muscle registers the moment a load is set down, with a tremor that was involuntary and not entirely dignified. She sat back down on the floor because her legs made the decision before she did. One of the agents, a woman, mid-30s, with the clipped movement of someone who had been doing this long enough to have developed economy, crouched down in front of her. "Ms. Bellamy." "Are you injured?" "My cheek," Mara said. "Gun barrel. And some glass. Nothing structural. We'll get a medic." In a minute, she held up the drive. "Chain of custody on this starts now. I need you to document receipt." The agent looked at the drive, looked at Mara. Something shifted in her face, a recalibration, the expression of a person reassessing the category they'd put someone in. "All right," she said. She took the drive with gloved hands and called for documentation. Across the annex, Rusk was being cuffed. He was not struggling. He stood against the wall with the stillness of a man who had done his final calculation and found his answer unacceptable but irrefutable. And he watched the agents work with the composed distance of someone who was already somewhere else in his mind, already in the next version of this, planning the defense, assessing the attorneys. A man like Rusk did not stop planning. He just changed what he was planning for. He looked at Mara once before they moved him. She looked back. Whatever he expected from that look, satisfaction, maybe, or fear, or some version of the triumph that comes from being the person who stood up, she didn't give him. She just looked at him, the way she'd looked at the ledger in the library on the 4th day, with the particular attention of someone cataloging information for later use. That was all he was now. A fact she'd established. Something she could move past. They walked him out through the far door. Silas came and crouched where the agent had been, in front of her, at her level. He had blood on his shirt, not his. She was fairly certain. From the cut above Costa's eye, and his expression was doing several things simultaneously, in the restrained way. His expressions always did several things simultaneously, like weather happening behind glass. "Costa," she said. "He's fine. Cut looks worse than it is." He looked at her cheek. "You have glass, I know." He reached out, and with 2 fingers carefully removed a piece of tube glass from her hair. He set it on the floor beside them. Then he sat down on the floor next to her, which was not something she'd expected, and which told her more about the state of him than anything he'd said in 4 hours. They sat on the annex floor. For a moment, the two of them, while federal agents moved around and through and past them with the business of a concluded operation. Someone had turned on additional lighting. The space looked worse in full light industrial. Temporary, the event dressing from the main floor not reaching back here at all, just concrete and steel and the debris of a very bad 20 minutes. "The backup receiver worked," she said. "Yes. Adler built a good system. Adler builds everything to last." A pause. "He's been with me since before my father died. He's the one who told me, afterward, that the explosion wasn't an accident. Couldn't prove it, but he knew." Mara looked at the far door where Rusk had been walked through. 8 years, she said. 8 years. He said it without particular inflection, which was itself the inflection. 8 years of knowing and not being able to act, of running an organization on the foundation of an unavenged thing, of waking up every morning inside that unresolved fact. It's a long time to carry something. It's done now, she said. Parts of it. He looked at the floor. There'll be proceedings. Federal case. It runs for, I know how long it runs. She had spent enough time with legal documents to know the architecture of a major federal prosecution. Months, maybe longer, but the foundation is solid. Raphael's documentation, the financial records, your father's witness list, the transmissions from tonight. Rusk's attorney is compromised, and Forsyth cooperated. Wynn's on the list, but he's also a cooperating witness. The case holds. Yes, he was quiet. The case holds. She turned her head and looked at him. The profile of a man sitting on a concrete floor in a formal shirt with blood on it, and his tie loosened, and his hands resting on his knees with the flatness of someone who had been holding himself operational for 6 hours and was now in the 2-minute window before the second wind runs out and the wall arrives. Go find your people, she said. Make sure everyone's accounted for. He looked at her. I'll be here, she said. He stood. He looked at her for 1 moment longer than was strictly operational. And still, with the expression she'd watched arrive in pieces over 9 days and still didn't have a clean name for. Then he moved, with the purposeful economy she'd catalogued on day 1 in a hallway, through the far door and into the operational aftermath of a night that was almost over. Mara sat on the floor and breathed. The medic who arrived was young and professional and cleaned the glass from her cheek with the careful thoroughness of someone who understood that people in formal attire who were sitting on warehouse floors at 7 in the morning had probably already had a very specific kind of evening and didn't need commentary added to it. Closed the cut with 2 small strips and told her it wouldn't scar if she kept it clean, and she thanked him and meant it. While he worked, she thought about Chen, the federal investigator who had been on Rusk's payroll for 2 years. The woman who had answered Adler's call in the middle of the night and agreed to sit outside the Caldwell complex and receive a live transmission. And who had been doing all of it? The phone calls, the case building, parallel investigation as a performance for the man she was supposed to be investigating. The agents who'd come through the doors tonight were not Chen's people. They were Adler's backup contacts people, from a different field office, a different chain of command entirely. Chen had been detained 40 minutes ago in her vehicle 3 blocks away, which Mara learned from the agent who'd taken the drive, who delivered this information with the careful neutrality of someone reporting a fact that implicated another federal officer, and was very aware of the weight of that. What happens to her? Mara asked. That's above my pay grade, the agent said. Is it above your pay grade to tell me whether she's alive? A pause. Yes, ma'am. She's alive. Mara nodded. She had complicated feelings about Chen that she was going to need more than 40 minutes of aftermath to sort through. A woman who'd been bought, who'd spent 2 years feeding Rusk information, who might have started with good intentions, or might have started exactly where she ended up. Mara didn't know and couldn't know yet, and the not knowing was its own kind of weight, the specific heaviness of a world in which the people who were supposed to be the clear categories kept refusing to stay in them. Stood up finally. Her legs held. The main floor of the Caldwell complex was being processed. The civilian gala attendees had been escorted out with the professional apologies of agents who were very sorry for the inconvenience and would be in touch regarding their statements. The foundation staff were in a cluster near the east wall, looking collectively stunned in the way of people whose charity event has become a federal crime scene. The bar was still stocked and untouched, and there was something absurd about that the bottles standing in their ordered rows, the ice melting in its buckets, the lemon slices drying on their little plates. Wynn was near the south access with one of Silas's men and 2 federal agents who were doing the preliminary work of his cooperation agreement. He looked up when Mara walked past, and she stopped. They looked at each other for a moment. There was no version of Calder Wynn that deserved what she might have offered him in different circumstance. Absolution. Understanding. The benefit of doubt applied retroactively to 11 years of choices. She knew that. He knew that. The knowing was visible in both their faces, which was its own kind of honesty. "The exit you wanted," she said. "It's complicated now." "I know. Cooperation doesn't make the witness list go away. It makes the disposition of it more navigable." "I know that too." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. He had the expression of a man in the middle of a very long reckoning that was going to outlast this morning by years. "I was 29, he said, in the meeting with Raphael. "I know, that's not an excuse." "No," she said. "It's not." She paused. "But it's a fact. Facts matter in proceedings." She looked at him for one more second. "Don't lie to them. Not about any of it. It's the only thing that actually helps you now." She walked on. She found her father at 6:30 in the morning, in the waiting area of the federal field office, where David Bellamy had been taken from the restaurant in the financial district how long ago? 36 hours? It felt like a different continent. He was sitting in a plastic chair with a paper cup of coffee he wasn't drinking and a federal public defender he'd been assigned and hadn't spoken to yet. Judging by the defender's expression. He looked up when she came in. He looked the same as he had in the restaurant. Trish thin. The suit he'd put on how long ago? 2 days? 3? Was ruined now in the specific way of clothing that has been slept in under duress. And he had the overnight stubble of a man who hadn't been given a razor and wouldn't have used one with any conviction even if he had. She sat down across from him, not beside him. Across. "It's done," she said. He looked at her cheek, at the 2 strips and the shadow of bruising that was coming up around them. Something crossed his face that she recognized as real, not the managed expressions of the man who'd handed her a pen and pointed at estate paperwork since she was 19. But something underneath those, the layer that existed before a person learns to present themselves instead of being themselves. "Your face," he said. "It'll heal, Mara, Dad." She said it cleanly. "Confession you gave. In the restaurant before the window. The recording is part of the federal evidentiary package now. Your cooperation, the financial access, the information transfers, what you knew about Raphael Veyer's documentation." She kept her voice even. "You're going to be charged. You need to work with the public defender or retain your own counsel, given what's left of the estate's finances, I'd suggest. The public defender is actually quite good, and you need to cooperate fully with the prosecution. Full cooperation. Nothing held back." He was looking at his coffee cup. "How much time? I don't know. That depends on the prosecutors and the cooperation level and the specifics of what you can provide about Rusk's operation over the years." She paused. "You have more than you think. You were inside that relationship for 12 years. What you know about how Rusk operated, who he bought, how he structured things that's substantive. It has value. Will it?" He stopped, started again. "Will any of it help you?" She looked at him. At the question, which was the most genuinely paternal thing he'd asked her in a very long time, not, "Can I use this?" Not, "How does this protect me?" but, "Will it help you?" Small and late and real. "I don't need help," she said. "I need you to be honest about what you did." To the prosecutors, to the court. She picked up the coffee cup he wasn't drinking and set it on the table behind her, out of the way. "That's the only thing left that you can actually do for me. Be honest about what you did." His face moved. She watched it move, and she let herself feel the complicated truth of it, that this was her father, this specific ruined man in this specific plastic chair, and that love and damage and disappointment were not separate rivers that you could choose between, but a single body of water you'd been swimming in your whole life. And you either learned to swim or you didn't. She had learned. "I'll cooperate," he said. "Everything." "Good." She stood up. She looked at him for a moment, let herself look fully, without the management that had been necessary for so long. "I'll come," she said, "to the proceedings, when they happen. I won't sit with you, but I'll come." He blinked. Once. The thing behind his eyes was too large for the space available, and she was not going to watch him try to contain it, because that would undo something in her that needed to stay done for now. She nodded at the public defender, who looked slightly less stunned than before, and walked out. The Veyer estate looked different in morning light. She hadn't seen it in morning light. From the outside she'd arrived in the dark, and had rarely been near the exterior since. Now she stood at the front of it, which she'd never done, and looked at the clean, brutal lines of it, the perimeter wall, The gate that had opened for 3 black SUVs 11 days ago, and for a very different kind of vehicle this morning. Adler was somewhere inside, handling the operational aftermath. Harrow was coordinating with federal liaisons. Costa had gotten his cut properly treated, and Reeves's shoulder was dislocated rather than broken, which was apparently the better version of that outcome. The household was running the particular kind of controlled managed chaos that happened when a large operation concluded, and everything that had been held in suspension while it ran now needed to land somewhere. Devi found her at the front steps. "There's tea," Devi said. "Course there is. And I've drawn a bath, which you will use before you do anything else, because you have dried blood in your hair." Mara looked at her. Devi had been in motion for 36 hours with the same steady efficiency she brought to everything. She looked not tired. Exactly. More like a person who allocated their energy with precision and was currently running on whatever was ever left after the allocation was complete. "Devi," Mara said, "what is it that you actually do here?" Devi looked at her with the expression that, over 11 days, Mara had come to understand as Devi's version of almost smiling. "I make sure things work," she said. "Come inside." The bath was very hot and very. Mara sat in it and very quiet, and Mara sat in it for 20 minutes and did not think about anything in particular, which was the first time, in 11 days, she had not been thinking about something in particular, and the not thinking was its own kind of work. She could feel her mind trying to pick up threads, to run the next problem, to find the next variable that needed managing, and having to consciously set each one down as it arrived. The debt, set down the recordings, set down her father in a plastic chair. Set down, not forgotten, not resolved, but set down. Scratch on her cheek that the medic said would heal, already setting itself down without her intervention. She dressed in clean clothes that were hers. She'd brought things from the apartment at some point. She couldn't remember when exactly. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. The woman in the mirror had 2 strips on her cheekbone, and hair that was still slightly damp, and the expression of someone who had been through something and was in the early minutes of understanding what the through meant. She went and found Silas. He was in the library. Of course, he was in the library. It was where things had started, where she'd found the ledger, where they'd first had a conversation that was about something real rather than the careful navigations of a strange and dangerous situation. He was standing at the window she'd spent 5 days sitting beside, and he was looking out at the walled garden, with his hands in his pockets and a cup of coffee on the windowsill that was probably also not being drunk. She came and stood beside him. The garden in morning light was just a garden. Stone paths and dormant flower beds and the repaired greenhouse frame at the far end, the glass replaced, the tarp gone, the evidence of a shooter's afternoon removed with the same methodical efficiency that had put a tarp over it within the hour. The fraudulent debt records, she said, destroyed this morning. Adler handled the digital files and I burned the physical ledger. He glanced at her. The original amount, what my father and yours actually arranged. That's gone with it. I'm not interested in collecting on a 12-year-old verbal agreement between dead men. She nodded. She'd expected this, but hearing it said plainly still required a moment. My family's connection to your organization, severed, publicly documented as severed as soon as the federal proceedings allow for public statements. He paused. Your father's estate, what's left of it legally, that's separate from any of this. It goes where the court proceedings take it. I have no claim. All right, she looked at the garden. Win. Cooperating witness. He stays in federal custody until the proceedings establish his disposition. He won't come back here. He said this without particular feeling, and she heard in the absence of feeling the full complicated weight of 11 years of manufactured loyalty and actual betrayal, and the fact that a man you trusted could be someone else entirely, and you could not always see it, no matter how carefully you looked. Petra, she said, detained this morning. She'd gotten as far as the train station. A pause. She'd been here for 3 years. She was good at her job. She was also very good at being someone else. Mara thought about this. About Petra, whom she'd seen at the edge of things the morning briefing, the hallways, and never registered as particular, because Petra had been exactly as visible as she'd chosen to be, which was just visible enough. Another lesson in the difference between what you saw and what was there. Adler's backup contact, she said. The second federal receiver. An investigator named Park, 12-year career, clean record, has been building a case against Rusk through the Financial Crimes Division. Adler met him through a compliance contact 8 months ago and cultivated the relationship carefully. He picked up the coffee cup and set it back down without drinking. He wasn't part of Chen's chain of command. Completely separate track. Adler is extraordinary, Mara said. Yes, Silas said. He is. They were quiet for a while. The morning light moved across the garden in the way of light that has decided to stay not the tentative early gray, but the committed yellow of a day that intends to be clear. The greenhouse glass caught it and threw it back in small specific pieces. The marriage contract, Mara said. She felt him look at her. The original one. The one my father signed. She kept her eyes on the garden. What happened to it? I burned it the morning after you found the ledger, he said. When I understood that whatever brought you here, the document that authorized it, had no standing I was willing to recognize. She turned and looked at him. He was looking back at her with the steady, assessing quality. She'd spent 11 days learning to read, but underneath it, present now in a way it hadn't been in the beginning, the thing that wasn't calculation, thing that had arrived in pieces, and was now simply there, the way weather that's been building is simply there when it arrives. Burned it a week ago, she said. Yes. Without telling me. You had other things to focus on. She looked at him for a long moment. At the shirt he'd changed into, at the tiredness around his eyes, that was the tiredness of a man who had been carrying 8 years of an unanswered thing, and had finally, this morning, been able to set it down. At the hands at his sides that she knew now, after 11 days of watching them, were loose when he was at rest and still when he was deciding, and that were, right now, at his sides and slightly open, which she understood was Silas Vare's version of an open door. I'm going to need somewhere to stay, she said, until the proceedings stabilize, and I can think about what comes next. You can stay here, he said. Not as not under any previous arrangement. Just here, she said. Yes. He nodded once. The nod of a man who had said everything available to him through direct speech and was not constitutionally capable of more in this moment, and knew it and was slightly frustrated by that knowledge. Picked up his coffee cup from the windowsills and handed it to him. Drink that, she said. It's been sitting there for 20 minutes. He took it. Their fingers touched in the transfer, briefly the ordinary domestic accident of two people sharing a small object in a small space. Neither of them moved away from it. 3 weeks later, Victor Rusk was formally indicted on 7 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, witness tampering, and the corruption of a federal officer. The indictment was 43 pages and referenced evidence from 3 separate sources, 2 cooperating witnesses, and a recorded transmission made from a warehouse annex at 7:07 in the morning. Gerald Forsyth negotiated a plea that cost him his license and his freedom for 18 months and left him in a house in a small coastal town that Mara suspected he had purchased specifically because it was the kind of place you went when you needed the world to be quiet for a while. Calder-Wynn's cooperation was thorough and expensive. He testified for 11 days across 3 separate sessions and provided information that extended the federal case into 3 additional areas of Rusk's operation that investigators had not previously mapped. His disposition was pending at the time. Mara stopped tracking it closely, which was approximately the point at which she decided that tracking it closely was not serving her. Her father pled guilty to 2 counts and received a reduced sentence in exchange for full cooperation. The proceedings were in a federal courthouse downtown, with marble floors and high ceilings, and the particular acoustics of rooms designed for formal consequence. Mara attended on the day of the plea. She sat in the gallery. Not the family section, in a coat she'd bought recently, because most of her previous wardrobe was still in an apartment she hadn't fully returned to. She watched her father stand up and say guilty in a voice that was steady, in the way of something that has had a long time to prepare. He looked at her once. When it was done, she nodded. He looked away. She stayed until the room cleared, and then she left through a side door and stood on the courthouse steps in the November cold and breathed the outside air and let the 11 days of that building's particular compressed atmosphere release from her chest. Adler was waiting at the bottom of the steps with a car. Of course he was. Adler existed in a state of perpetual logistical readiness that she'd come to rely on in the way you relied on fixed points. How was it, he said. Final, she said. That's the right word for it. He opened the car door. She got in. The library had become, without formal discussion or announcement, her room. Not the East Wing room she'd been given on arrival, that was still technically her sleeping quarters, and she used it as such. But the library was where she worked, where she sat with tea, and the particular winter light that came through the south-facing window in the afternoon, where she'd spread her thesis notes on the reading table and begun, slowly and with the strange double vision of someone returning to a previous life from a very great distance, to work again. Medieval property law. The mechanisms by which women were transferred between households as legal instruments. She'd developed, over the weeks, a theory about the chapter she'd been stuck on. Before all of this, a reframing of the agency question. The ways in which the women at the center of those transfers had found and exercised control within systems designed to deny it. She worked on it in the afternoons. It was slow and good, and it connected her to something she'd had before the black SUVs arrived, something she hadn't been sure would still be there when she reached back for it. Still there. Silas came into the library in the evenings, the way he'd always moved through his own house, without announcement. He'd read, mostly, or work on whatever the business of the organization required in the aftermath of a federal investigation into one of its primary rivals. That reconstruction was ongoing and complex and occasionally required conversations she was adjacent to, without being central, which was a geography she found comfortable. Present, not consumed. They had not talked directly about what they were. This felt, to Mara, not like avoidance, but like the accurate recognition that what they were was still in the process of becoming what it would be, and naming it prematurely would be like naming a building while the foundation was still wet. They ate dinner together most evenings. They walked the garden in the mornings. When the weather allowed, the same path Silas had always taken, which she now walked beside him. They argued, occasionally, about things that were genuinely arguable, the estate's legal situation, the specifics of the federal timeline. Once about a book she thought he'd misread, and the arguments were clean and direct, and resolved without residue. One evening she came into the library, and he was standing at the reading table with a document in his hand, and she stopped because his expression was different, not the assessment, not the controlled management of complicated feeling, something simpler and older than those things. "What is it?" she said. He set the document on the table and turned it toward her. It was the original marriage contract, or a copy of it, a full photocopy of the document her father had signed in the early morning of 11 weeks ago, with the signatures, the debt figures, the Vescari organizational seal. She looked at it. "Where did this come from?" she said. "Rusk's files," Silas said. "The federal evidence package. Adler flagged it. It was in the materials copied from Rusk's server before we wiped it. He had a copy because he'd helped engineer the arrangement." He paused. "Prosecutors have the original evidence. This is a copy from our end." She looked at it for a long moment. At her father's signature, the cramped, hurried script she'd recognized in the note he'd sent through Devi, weeks that felt like years ago. At the debt figure, 7.4 million, fraudulent, manufactured, a number built to trap and transfer and control. Picked up the document. She crossed to the fireplace, which was burning low in the November evening, and she put the photocopy into it, and watched the paper catch and curl and become light and heat and then nothing. When she turned around, Silas was still at the reading table. He was looking at her with the expression she'd stopped trying to name, the one that had arrived in pieces, and was simply there now, steady and present, the way things are when they've finished arriving. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something on the reading table. It was a single page, plain paper, not legal document stock, with clean typed text that she crossed the room to read. It was an agreement between two named parties. It was short, only a few paragraphs, and its terms were simple. Freely made, no coercion, no debt, no condition except the condition of choosing. It was not a marriage contract in any form she'd seen before, because it had no institutional framing, no organizational language, no threat built into its architecture. It was simply two people setting down in writing what they had been moving toward. For 11 weeks, stated plainly. At the bottom, his signature was already there. She read it once. She read it again. She picked up the pen from the reading table. "You know this isn't legally binding," she said. "I know," he said. "A document like this wouldn't hold up in—" "I know," he said again. She looked at him, at the steady face and the open hands, and the 11 weeks of a man who had looked at her in a hallway at 2 in the morning like she was furniture in the wrong room, and had since, systematically and without announcement, revised every assumption he'd arrived at with until the revision was complete. "Silas," she said. "Yes. You understand that I'm going to finish my thesis?" "Yes. And that I'm going to need to go back to the university at some point. Resume my program. My committee is—" "I know, and that I'm not going to be—" She stopped, found the right words. "Contained. In any configuration of this." "No," he said, with the simplicity of a man, stating something that has been true for a long time. "You've never been containable. I noticed that approximately 4 days in." She looked at the paper in her hand. She thought about the woman in the bathroom mirror, the strips on her cheekbone, the damp hair, the expression of someone understanding what through meant. Thought about her father in a plastic chair. She thought about her father and her thesis on the reading table and the morning light in the garden and a stone bench that a man had ducked behind while someone tried to kill him, and how she'd been at the window because she'd been looking. Always. Because looking was what she did. She thought about the specific irreducible fact of having chosen to stay, not because she owed a debt, not because she had nowhere else, not because the alternative was worse, because she had assessed the available evidence and made a clear-eyed determination, and the determination was this: here, with this specific difficult and genuine man, in this specific complicated life, was where she wanted to be. She signed her name. She set the pen down. She put the paper on the table between them and placed her hand flat on it for a moment, the way she placed her hand flat on things she was certain of, and then she looked up at him. Dawn was still hours away. Outside the library window, the garden held its winter stillness, the stone paths silver in the dark, the repaired greenhouse catching no light because there was no light yet to catch. The city beyond the wall was running its ordinary machinery, the traffic and the lit windows and the sound of a world that did not know what had happened in a warehouse annex or a courthouse gallery or a library where a woman had signed a piece of paper that had no legal standing and meant more than any document she'd ever held. Silas took her hand, not off the paper, with the paper beneath it, his hand over hers, the agreement between their palms like something preserved. They stood like that for a moment in the winter quiet of a house that had been many things, and was, now, something new, not a compound. Not a compound, not a prison with luxury fittings, not the architecture of a feared man's isolation. Just a house, with a library and a walled garden, and 2 people who had arrived at each other through 11 weeks of debt and betrayal and gunfire, and the particular grace of 2 people who kept looking directly at things instead of away from them. "Thesis," Silas said. "The chapter you've been working on. What about it? The reframing, the agency question." He paused with the slight awkwardness of a man who reads widely, but is not accustomed to discussing it. "It's right. What you've been arguing. About finding the room to move inside, a system designed to prevent it." She looked at him. "You read my notes. They were on the reading table. For weeks." "Yes." He didn't apologize. "You're right about the chapter." She thought about arguing that he'd had no business reading her thesis notes, and that the library being a shared space did not constitute implied permission, and that this was exactly the kind of boundary they were going to need to establish, clearly going forward. Then she thought about how it felt to have someone read the work that mattered to her and find it right.
"I know I'm right,"
she said. "I've been right about it for 2 weeks. I just needed to write my way to it." "Then write your way to it," he said. Outside, the first gray of the morning was beginning to separate itself from the dark, a slow, irreversible process of dawn that happened regardless of what had occurred in the night. Before it, the warehouse, the courthouse, the signed page, all of it absorbed into the ordinary passage of time that did not pause for human consequence, but simply continued, carrying everything forward into the next light. Mara looked at the window. She looked at the man beside her. She thought about the woman she'd been 11 weeks ago, the nightgown, the bare feet, the 30 seconds to put on shoes, the car moving through the rain towards something she hadn't chosen and couldn't refuse. She thought about what she'd decided in that car, in the dark, between two men who smelled of cologne and gunmetal. That she wasn't going to look at the floor. That looking at the floor got you nowhere. She hadn't looked at the floor once. "Go to sleep," she said. "You've been awake for 22 hours. So I'm going to sit here for a little longer." She gestured at the reading table, the thesis notes, the winter morning assembling itself beyond the glass. "I want to write something down before I lose it." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that didn't have a name and didn't need one. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do. Not once in 11 weeks, not in gardens, or annexes, or courthouse galleries, or floors of any kind. He smiled. It was not a large smile. It was the smile of a man who had held something at a distance for a very long time, and had finally, this morning, in a library, in the early minutes of a winter dawn, allowed it to be close. Then he walked out. She sat down at the reading table. She pulled her thesis notes toward her. She picked up the pen, the same pen, or one like it didn't matter. And she found the chapter she'd been working toward for 2 weeks, and she began to write. Outside, the dawn came on.